A single iron nail, pulled from the frozen earth of a Norwegian fjord, still holding the shape of the ship it once fastened together more than 1,000 years ago. Such small remnants are what remain of a people who carved their names across 3 continents, who prayed to gods of thunder and trickery, who sailed beyond the edge of every known map. The Vikings were never simply raiders, though the monasteries of Britain learned to fear the sight of square sails on the horizon. They were farmers, poets, merchants who traded walrus ivory in Baghdad and settled green valleys in Iceland, where no human foot had ever walked. If these quiet histories bring some ease to the end of your day, staying subscribed means more slow evenings like this one. The year is 793. The place a windswept island called Lindisfarne, and the story begins here. And so we arrive at the beginning, the quiet origins of a people who had come to shape the course of European history, though at this moment we find them simply as farmers and fishermen, tending to their animals and crops in the northern reaches of the world, in a land of mountains and fjords and long winter nights, a land that would forge a particular kind of resilience in those who called it home. The region we now know as Scandinavia comprises 3 distinct territories, each with its own character and geography, though all sharing certain qualities that would prove formative in the centuries to come. Norway stretches along the western edge of the peninsula, a narrow ribbon of habitable land pressed between the sea and the mountains, where deep fjords cut inland like fingers reaching into the rock, and where the coastline extends for thousands upon thousands of kilometers, if one were patient enough to trace every inlet and bay. Sweden lies to the east, broader and more forested, with its Great Lakes and its gentler agricultural plains in the southern regions, while Denmark occupies the peninsula of Jutland and its surrounding islands, the most southerly of the 3, the most connected to the European continent, with flatter lands more suited to farming on a larger scale. The climate of this region presented both challenges and opportunities to those who lived there, and understanding this climate helps us understand why the people of Scandinavia would eventually look outward, beyond their own shores, to find what they could not find at home. The winters were long and dark, particularly in the northern reaches of Norway, where the sun might not rise above the horizon for weeks at a time during the coldest months, and where snow could blanket the ground from autumn well into spring. The growing season was correspondingly short, limited to those precious months when the soil could be worked and the crops could take in enough sunlight to mature before the frost returned. This was not a land of agricultural abundance, not a place where a family might easily grow wealthy from farming alone, though farming was nevertheless the foundation upon which society rested, as it was in so many places throughout the medieval world. The mountains of Norway made overland travel difficult in many areas, which meant that the sea became the natural highway, the most practical means of moving from one settlement to another, of transporting goods, of maintaining connections between communities that might be separated by impassable terrain. The Scandinavians became, by necessity, skilled sailors and boat builders, learning to read the currents and the winds, learning to construct vessels that could navigate both the open ocean and the shallow coastal waters. And this maritime expertise would prove essential when the time came for longer voyages to distant shores. Now, regarding the term Viking itself, it is worth pausing to consider what this word actually meant to those who used it, because our modern understanding has drifted somewhat from the original sense. The word derives from the Old Norse, vikinga, and while scholars have debated its precise etymology, with some suggesting a connection to the word vik, meaning bay or inlet, and others proposing different origins. What is reasonably clear is that in the early medieval period, the term referred specifically to the activity of going on raids, of engaging in piracy or maritime warfare, rather than describing an entire people or culture. A man might go Viking, meaning he might embark on a raiding expedition, but this was something one did, rather than something one permanently was, much as a person today might go fishing without thereby becoming, in their entire identity, a fisher. The farmers and traders and craftspeople who remained at home, tending their fields and their animals, were not typically called Vikings by their contemporaries, even though we now use the term loosely to describe the entire culture of medieval Scandinavia during a particular period of expansion and exploration. This is a gentle but important distinction, and understanding it helps us appreciate that the image we often hold of the Vikings, as fierce warriors with horned helmets storming across the seas, represents only one aspect of a more complex society, a society in which most people, most of the time, were engaged in the ordinary tasks of daily life, in growing food and raising children and building homes and observing the customs of their communities. The social structure of this society was hierarchical, as was typical of the medieval world, though it possessed certain features that distinguished it from the feudal arrangements emerging elsewhere in Europe. At the apex of the social order stood the jarls, the nobles or chieftains who controlled significant wealth and land, who maintained retinues of warriors and commanded the loyalty of those who lived within their territories. Below the jarls were the carls, the freemen who formed the broad middle stratum of society, farmers and craftspeople and traders who owned their own land or plied their own trades, who possessed legal rights and could participate in the assemblies that governed community life. And at the bottom of the hierarchy were the thralls, the enslaved people who had lost their freedom through capture in war, through birth to enslaved parents, through debt, or through various other misfortunes, and who labored without rights or autonomy for those who owned them. This three-tiered structure was not entirely rigid, and movement between the levels was possible under certain circumstances, with thralls sometimes being granted their freedom, and carls sometimes accumulating enough wealth to enter the ranks of the jarls, though such mobility was the exception rather than the rule, and the distinctions between the classes were enforced through law and custom alike. One of the most notable features of Scandinavian governance was the institution of the Thing, an assembly where free men would gather to settle disputes, to make laws, and to address matters of common concern. These assemblies were held at regular intervals at designated meeting places, often in the open air, and they represented a form of participatory governance that, while not democratic in the modern sense, nevertheless provided a mechanism through which the community could collectively address its affairs. The Thing was presided over by a law speaker, a person charged with memorizing and reciting the laws, with interpreting them in specific cases, and with maintaining the legal knowledge that bound the community together. The most famous of these assemblies was the Althing, established in Iceland in the year 930 of the Common Era, which served as both a legislative and judicial body for the entire island settlement. The Althing met annually at Thingvellir, a place of striking natural beauty, where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates visibly diverge, creating a dramatic landscape of rifts and cliffs and open plains. Here, for 2 weeks each summer, the free settlers of Iceland would gather to resolve disputes, to announce new laws, to conduct trade, to arrange marriages, and to renew the social bonds that held their far-flung communities together across the long winter months. The Althing would continue to meet for centuries, and it stands as one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. A remarkable legacy of the Scandinavian approach to collective governance. Among the factors that contributed to the outward expansion of Scandinavian peoples during the Viking Age, the practice of primogeniture deserves particular attention, though it operated differently in different regions and at different times. In many Scandinavian families, particularly among the landowning classes, the eldest son would inherit the bulk of the family's property, leaving younger sons with limited prospects at home. These younger sons, possessing perhaps some share of movable wealth but lacking land of their own, faced a choice between accepting a diminished status in their home communities or seeking their fortunes elsewhere, whether through trade, through service in the retinue of a powerful jarl, or through the raiding expeditions that would give the Viking Age its name. The pressure of inheritance thus pushed a steady stream of ambitious young men outward, providing the human energy that would fuel centuries of exploration, settlement, and conquest. Before the period we typically identify as the Viking Age, which is conventionally dated from the raid on Lindisfarne in 703 to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. There was an earlier era that laid the cultural and technological foundations for what was to come. This is known as the Vendel period, spanning roughly from 550 to 790 of the Common Era, named after a site in Sweden where richly furnished boat graves were discovered in the late 19th century. During the Vendel period, the Scandinavians developed many of the artistic styles, the shipbuilding techniques, and the social structures that would characterize the later Viking Age. The elaborate metalwork found in Vendel period graves, with its intricate animal ornamentation and its skilled craftsmanship, demonstrates a society of considerable sophistication, capable of supporting specialized artisans and accumulating significant wealth, even if that wealth remained concentrated in the hands of the elite. The Vendel period thus represents not a sharp break from what came before, but rather a gradual evolution, a slow gathering of the cultural elements that would eventually coalesce into the Viking Age proper. Daily life for most people in Scandinavian society centered on the farm, on the unending cycle of planting and harvesting, of tending animals and maintaining buildings, of preparing for the long winter and making the most of the short summer. The primary crops were barley and rye, hardy grains suited to the northern climate and the short growing season, supplemented by oats and various vegetables where conditions permitted. Cattle were kept for their milk, their meat, and their hides, while sheep provided wool for the textiles that kept families warm through the dark months, and pigs were raised for pork, a meat that could be preserved through salting and smoking to sustain the household when fresh food was scarce. Fishing and hunting added variety to the diet, particularly in coastal areas where the sea offered its abundance of cod and herring and other species, and in the forested interior where game could be found by those with the skill to track and take it. The heart of the farmstead was the longhouse, a large rectangular building constructed of timber and turf that served as the primary dwelling for the extended family and sometimes for their animals as well, with humans occupying one end and livestock the other during the coldest months, the body heat of the animals contributing to the warmth of the interior. At the center of the longhouse ran the long hearth, a fire that burned continuously through the winter, providing heat and light and a place for cooking, its smoke rising to escape through holes in the roof or through the gaps in the walls, leaving the interior perpetually hazy but reasonably warm. Along the walls ran benches that served as seating during the day and as sleeping platforms at night, and the walls themselves might be hung with tapestries or decorated with carved wooden panels, depending on the wealth and status of the family. Archaeological excavations have given us remarkable insights into the scale and sophistication of these longhouses, and nowhere is this more striking than at the site of Borg in the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway, where researchers uncovered the largest Viking-era building yet discovered. This structure measured approximately 83 meters in length, a truly massive dwelling that would have housed a chieftain of considerable power and wealth, along with his extended family, his servants, and his retainers. The finds at Borg included fragments of decorated glassware, gold foil figures, and other high-status objects that speak to the far-reaching trade connections of this remote community. Connections that brought luxury goods from distant lands to this island above the Arctic Circle. The Borg Longhouse was not typical of Viking-era dwellings, most of which were considerably more modest, but it demonstrates what was possible at the upper reaches of society, the scale of wealth and ambition that the most powerful chieftains could command. And so we have sketched, in broad strokes, the world from which the Vikings would emerge, a world of long winters and short summers, of scattered farms and maritime travel, of hierarchical societies governed by assemblies of free men, of younger sons seeking fortune beyond the horizons of their birth. It was a world shaped by its geography, by the mountains and the fjords and the sea, by the limitations of the soil and the possibilities of the waters. And understanding this world helps us understand the impulses that would send Scandinavian ships across the known world and beyond, though that is a story for another time. And for now, we may rest with this picture of the northern homelands, of the long houses with their central hearths, of the farmers bringing in the barley harvest before the first frost, of the quiet origins of a people who would make their marks so dramatically upon history. The date was the 8th of June, in the year 793 of the Common Era, and on that particular morning, the monks of Lindisfarne rose as they always did, in the pale grey light that comes so early to the northeastern coast of Britain during the summer months, and they made their way to the church for the first prayers of the day, their sandaled feet moving along the well-worn paths between the stone buildings, their voices lifting in the familiar Latin chants that had echoed across this small tidal island for more than 150 years. And there was nothing in the quality of the air or the colour of the sky to suggest that this day would be remembered for more than 1,000 years to come, that it would be written about in chronicles and letters and historical accounts, and that it would come to mark, in the minds of many scholars, the beginning of what we now call the Viking Age. The island of Lindisfarne, which is also known as Holy Island, sits just off the coast of Northumbria, connected to the mainland by a causeway that appears and disappears with the rhythm of the tides. And in those days, it was one of the most sacred places in all of Anglo-Saxon England, a centre of Christian learning and devotion that drew pilgrims from across the land, and its origins stretched back to the year 635, when a gentle and devoted monk named Odin had travelled south from the monastery of Iona at the invitation of King Oswald of Northumbria to bring the Christian faith to the people of that kingdom. And Odin had chosen this small island as the site for his monastery because it reminded him of Iona, with its windswept shores and its sense of peaceful separation from the troubles of the world. And from that beginning, the community had grown and flourished, becoming a place of great spiritual significance and considerable material wealth. The monastery had produced, some decades before the raid, one of the most beautiful books ever created in the medieval world, the Lindisfarne Gospels, which was an illuminated manuscript of extraordinary artistry, its pages decorated with intricate patterns of interlacing lines and spirals, with images of the four evangelists, with letters that seemed to dance and twist in colors of red and blue and gold. And although by the time of the raid, the original manuscript may have been moved to a safer location, the monastery still contained many treasures of similar nature. Books copied by hand over long years of patient labor, their covers sometimes adorned with precious metals and gems. And these were among the possessions that would have drawn the attention of men seeking portable wealth. But the books, precious as they were to the monks who had created them, and to the scholars who studied them, were perhaps not the primary attraction for those who came from across the sea. For the monastery also possessed silver chalices used in the celebration of the Mass, and gold reliquaries that held the bones of saints, and altar vessels of fine craftsmanship, and all the accumulated gifts that had been given to the community over more than a century and a half by kings and nobles and wealthy pilgrims seeking to secure the prayers of the monks for the benefit of their souls. And all of these things, the silver and the gold and the gems, could be easily carried away and melted down or sold, and they represented a concentration of wealth that would have seemed almost unimaginable to farmers and fishermen from the harsh lands of Scandinavia. In the months before the attack, there had been signs and portents that troubled the people of Northumbria, or so the chronicles tell us, and we must understand that the people of that time lived in a world where such signs were taken very seriously indeed, where unusual events in the natural world were believed to carry messages from God or warnings of things to come. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is our most important source for the events of this period, records that in this year there were immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and that fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. And while we might today explain such phenomena as unusual weather patterns, or perhaps as the aurora borealis, which can sometimes be visible at these latitudes during periods of strong solar activity, all possibly as misremembered details added to the account after the fact to make the disaster seem more portentous, the people of the time saw them as clear warnings of divine displeasure. And when the attack came, these signs seemed to many to be proof that God had allowed this terrible thing to happen as punishment for the sins of the English people. The ships appeared on the morning tide, their square sails perhaps visible first as small shapes on the horizon, growing larger as they approached, and the monks who saw them may have thought at first that they were traders or fishermen, for ships were not an uncommon sight in these waters. But as the vessels drew closer, their true nature became apparent, for these were longships of a type not often seen on English shores, low and sleek and fast, their prows carved with the heads of beasts, and they carried men armed with swords and axes and spears, men who had rowed and sailed across the cold waters of the North Sea with the specific intention of taking what the monastery possessed, and the monks who lived lives of prayer and contemplation, who had no weapons and no training in warfare, who had never imagined that anyone would dare to attack a place so holy, found themselves utterly defenseless against this sudden violence. The attack itself was swift and brutal, as such attacks tend to be, and although we do not have a detailed eyewitness account of exactly what happened on that June morning, we can piece together the general course of events from the letters and chronicles that were written in the months and years that followed. And what emerges is a picture of complete devastation, of sacred spaces violated, of treasures plundered, of blood spilled on ground that had been consecrated to peace and prayer. And the fate of the monks was various and terrible, for some were killed outright, cut down where they stood, or perhaps as they tried to flee, and some were driven into the sea and drowned in the cold waters that surrounded the island. And some were taken away as captives, to be sold as slaves in the markets of Scandinavia or Ireland, their lives of devotion replaced by lives of servitude in a foreign land. The news of the attack spread quickly across the Christian world, carried by messengers and letters, and it provoked reactions of horror and dismay. For Lindisfarne was not just any monastery, but one of the most revered sites in all of England, the place where St. Cuthbert had lived and died, where his relics were kept and venerated, and the idea that pagans from across the sea had dared to attack such a place had shed the blood of monks and carried away sacred objects, seemed to many to be a sign that the world itself was coming to an end, that the final days foretold in Scripture were at hand. And this sense of apocalyptic dread is clearly present in the letters written by Alcuin of York, who was one of the most learned men of his time, a scholar and teacher who had served at the court of Charlemagne, and who had been born in Northumbria and educated at the cathedral school in York, and who therefore felt the attack on Lindisfarne as a personal blow, a violation of the land and the faith that had shaped his youth. In his letter to King Ethelred of Northumbria, written in the immediate aftermath of the raid, Alcuin expressed his shock and grief in words that have echoed down through the centuries, and he wrote that never before had such terror appeared in Britain as that which they had now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. And these words capture the sense of bewilderment and fear that the attack provoked. The feeling that something unprecedented had occurred, that the natural order of things had been overturned. For the people of England had grown accustomed to thinking of the sea as a barrier that protected them from invasion, and they had perhaps forgotten that other peoples also possessed the skills to cross that barrier, and that what the sea could protect, it could also deliver. But Alcuin, being a man of his time and his faith, did not simply lament the attack, for he also sought to understand it in religious terms, to find meaning in the disaster, and he suggested to King Ethelred that the raid might be a punishment sent by God to chastise the English for their sins, that the violence of the pagans was an instrument of divine correction, and this interpretation was widely shared among the clergy and scholars of the time, and it led to calls for repentance and reform, for a return to the strict observance of Christian morality, in the hope that such piety might avert future disasters. And while this way of understanding the event may seem strange to modern readers, it was a natural and even comforting response for people who believed that God was actively involved in the affairs of the world, and who needed to find some purpose in the suffering they had witnessed. The raid on Lindisfarne was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a collection of annals that were kept at various monasteries in England, recording the major events of each year in brief and often sparse entries. And the entry for the year 793 notes the dire portents that had been seen earlier in the year, and then records that the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. And this entry, like much of the Chronicle, is frustratingly brief, leaving out many details that we would dearly love to know. But its very existence is significant, for it shows that the event was considered important enough to be remembered and recorded, to be included in the official history of the English people. There is, in the small museum at Lindisfarne Priory today, a remarkable carved stone that may provide a visual record of the attack, or at least of the age of violence that it inaugurated. And this stone, which is sometimes called the Doomsday Stone or the Viking Stone, shows on one side a procession of warriors, armed with swords and axes, their weapons raised as if in threat or celebration, and on the other side a cross, and figures that appear to be in attitudes of prayer or supplication. And while scholars debate the exact date and meaning of this carving, many believe that it was created in the years following the raid, as a memorial to the violence that had been suffered, or perhaps as a warning of the dangers that now threatened the Christian communities of the coast. And whether or not this interpretation is correct, the stone stands today as a tangible reminder of that distant time, a piece of carved history that visitors can see and touch. The attack on Lindisfarne was so successful, from the raiders' point of view, that it was followed by other attacks in the years that came after. For the men who had crossed the sea and returned home laden with silver and gold and slaves would have told their stories in the halls and farmsteads of Scandinavia. And other men would have listened, and would have fitted out their own ships, and would have set sail for the coasts of Britain and Ireland and Francia, seeking similar rewards. And in the following year, 794, there were raids on the monasteries of Jarrow and Wearmouth, also in Northumbria, and in the years after that, the attack spread further, reaching Ireland and Scotland and the islands of the west, and what had begun as isolated raids gradually became a sustained campaign of plunder and eventually of settlement, changing the history of the British Isles in ways that would unfold over the next 3 centuries. The monasteries were ideal targets for these early raiders, and this was not by accident or coincidence, but rather because of the particular nature of these institutions and their place in the society of the time. For the monasteries were wealthy, having accumulated over many generations the gifts of kings and nobles, the offerings of pilgrims, the products of their own skilled craftsmen, and they stored this wealth in forms that were easily portable, in chalices and reliquaries and ornaments of gold and silver, in fine textiles and illuminated books, and unlike the treasuries of kings, which were guarded by armed retainers and protected by fortified walls, the treasuries of monasteries were protected mainly by the sanctity of the place itself, by the belief that no one would dare to violate ground that had been consecrated to God, and this belief, which had been sufficient protection against Christian raiders, meant nothing to the pagan warriors from across the sea. Furthermore, the monasteries were often located on coasts or on islands, or beside navigable rivers, and this was not because the monks were careless of defense, but because they had chosen such locations for other reasons, for the convenience of receiving supplies and pilgrims, for the spiritual benefits of isolation and separation from the secular world, for the fishing and farming opportunities that such sites afforded, and these same features that made the monasteries pleasant and productive places to live also made them supremely vulnerable to attack from the sea, for the raiders could approach quickly and unexpectedly, could carry out their plundering before any defense could be organized, and could depart by the same route they had come, disappearing over the horizon before news of the attack had even reached the nearest center of royal authority. And so, the 8th of June, 793, stands in history as the day when the Viking Age began, or at least as the day when the Christian peoples of Western Europe became aware that a new force had entered their world, a force that would shape the following centuries in ways they could not then have imagined, bringing destruction and death, but also trade and settlement and cultural exchange. And the monks who died on that morning, whose names are mostly lost to us now, who were simply going about the routines of their daily devotions when death came for them from across the sea, became the first casualties of an era of transformation, and their monastery, though it was rebuilt and continued for many years, never quite recovered its former glory. And the Lindisfarne Gospels, that beautiful book, would eventually make its way to London, where it remains today, a memorial to the community that created it, and to the day when the thunder came from the sea The ships that carried the Norse across the waters of the known world were not merely vessels of transport, but rather the culmination of centuries of careful refinement, each generation of shipbuilders learning from those who came before, adjusting and improving upon techniques passed down through long winters and brief summers in the boat sheds of Scandinavia. These were craft born of necessity and shaped by the particular demands of northern waters, where the sea could shift from glassy calm to churning grey within the span of an afternoon, and where the ability to navigate shallow coastal waters and deep ocean swells with equal confidence meant the difference between prosperity and oblivion. The longship, in its various forms, represented perhaps the most significant technological achievement of the Viking Age, a floating platform that enabled everything from lightning raids on distant monasteries to the establishment of trade routes stretching from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America. And it is to the construction and capabilities of these remarkable vessels that we now turn our attention, taking our time to understand the craftsmanship that made such journeys possible. The fundamental technique that distinguished Norse shipbuilding from many other traditions of the ancient and medieval world was what scholars and shipwrights now refer to as clinker construction, a method in which the planks forming the hull were arranged so that each one overlapped the plank below it, rather like the scales of a fish or the feathers of a bird when viewed from the proper angle. This overlapping arrangement, with each strake or row of planking positioned to cover the upper edge of the one beneath, created a distinctive stepped appearance on the exterior of the hull, and the planks were fastened together at these overlapping joints using iron rivets that passed through both layers of wood before being clenched or bent over on the inside to hold everything firmly in place. The process required considerable skill and no small amount of patience, as the shipwright needed to ensure that each plank was properly shaped to follow the curves of the hull while maintaining consistent overlap along its entire length. And the riveting had to be done with enough force to draw the planks tightly together without splitting the wood or creating gaps that would allow water to seep through. Between the overlapping planks, the builders would often place strands of animal hair or wool soaked in tar, creating a seal that could flex slightly with the movement of the hull while still preventing leakage. And this attention to waterproofing was essential for vessels that would spend weeks or months at sea. The internal structure of these clinker-built hulls relied upon a system of ribs and crossbeams that provided strength without excessive rigidity. And here we encounter one of the most ingenious aspects of Viking ship design, the quality that allowed these vessels to survive conditions that might have destroyed less thoughtfully constructed craft. Rather than building a rigid framework first and then attaching planking to it, as was common in many Mediterranean shipbuilding traditions, the Norse shipwrights typically assembled the outer shell of the hull first, shaping and riveting the planks together, and only then added the internal ribs and supports, which were often lashed to cleats left projecting from the inner surface of the planking rather than being nailed or pegged directly through it. This approach, combined with the natural flexibility of the clinker construction itself, allowed the hull to twist and flex slightly as it encountered waves, absorbing the energy of the sea rather than fighting against it in a battle the ship could never win. Sailors who have experienced this phenomenon in replica vessels describe the hull as seeming to breathe with the motion of the water, a gentle working of the timbers that might alarm those accustomed to more rigid modern craft, but which actually indicates that the ship is responding to its environment in precisely the way its builders intended. Among the most complete and informative examples of Viking shipbuilding to survive into the modern era is the vessel known as the Gokstad ship, which was discovered in the year 1880 within a burial mound near the farm of Gokstad in Vestfold County, Norway. The ship had been placed in the earth sometime around the year 900, serving as the burial chamber for a man of considerable status, whose remains, along with various grave goods, were found within, though unfortunately the mound had been disturbed by grave robbers at some point in the distant past, and many items that might have been present were lost before the archaeological excavation took place. The ship itself, however, survived in remarkable condition, preserved by the particular characteristics of the clay soil in which it had rested for nearly a millennium, and when carefully excavated and eventually restored, it revealed itself to be a vessel of impressive proportions and excellent workmanship. Measuring approximately 23 meters in length from stem to stern and just over 5 meters in width at its broadest point, the Gokstad ship was designed to accommodate 32 oarsmen, 16 on each side, with oar holes cut through the upper planking and equipped with small wooden discs that could be rotated to seal the openings when the oars were not in use. The vessel was also fitted with a sturdy mast that could be raised and lowered as conditions required, supporting a single large square sail that scholars estimate would have covered an area of roughly 110 square meters when fully deployed, providing ample power for ocean crossings when the winds were favorable. A second burial ship of perhaps even greater archaeological significance was discovered in 1904 near the farm of Oseberg, also in Vestfold County, and this vessel presents a somewhat different character from its Gokstad counterpart, though both demonstrate the sophistication of Norse shipbuilding during the height of the Viking Age. The Oseberg ship had been buried in the year 834, based on the evidence of tree ring dating applied to timbers found within the mound, making it somewhat older than the Gokstad vessel, and it served as the final resting place for 2 women whose identities remain a matter of scholarly discussion, though the richness of the grave goods suggests that at least one of them held significant social or religious status. What distinguishes the Oseberg ship most immediately from other surviving examples is the extraordinary level of decorative carving that adorns its bow and stern, where skilled woodworkers created elaborate patterns of intertwining animals and abstract designs that spiral and twist across the timber in a display of artistic achievement that seems almost excessive for a vessel intended for practical use. The bow in particular rises in a graceful curve that terminates in a serpent-like head, the wood covered in intricate carvings that must have required countless hours of patient work to complete, and scholars have long debated whether the ship was built primarily for ceremonial purposes or whether it saw actual service on the water before being selected for its final role as a burial vessel. The grave goods found with the ship included sledges and a cart, similarly decorated with elaborate carvings, as well as textiles, household items, and the remains of animals sacrificed as part of the burial ritual, offering a glimpse into the material culture of the early 9th century that continues to inform our understanding of the period. The design of these and other Viking vessels incorporated several features that gave them particular advantages in the waters of Northern Europe and beyond, and chief among these was the shallow draft that allowed even relatively large ships to navigate waters that would be impassable for deeper-hulled craft. The term draft refers to the depth of water a vessel requires in order to float freely without its hull touching the bottom, and for ships like the Gokstad vessel, this measurement was remarkably small, often around half a meter or only slightly more even when the ship was fully loaded with crew and cargo. This shallow draft meant that Viking ships could sail directly up rivers that would block access to other seagoing vessels, penetrating deep into continental Europe along waterways like the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, and the rivers of what is now Russia, reaching settlements and monasteries that their inhabitants had previously considered safely remote from any seaborne threat. The same characteristic allowed these ships to be beached directly on sandy or gravelly shores without the need for constructed harbors or deep-water anchorages, so that a raiding party could run their vessel up onto land, conduct whatever business had brought them there, and depart again before any organized response could be mounted. A tactical flexibility that contributed significantly to the success of Viking military operations during the 9th and 10th centuries. The keel of a Viking ship represents another innovation of considerable importance. A single massive timber running along the bottom of the hull from bow to stern that provided both structural strength and hydrodynamic advantages. Before the development of the true keel, earlier Scandinavian boats had relatively flat bottoms that made them stable in calm waters, but which limited their performance in rougher conditions and reduced their ability to sail at angles to the wind. The deep keel of vessels like the Gokstad and Oseberg ships extended below the bottom of the hull proper, creating a sort of fin that bit into the water and resisted the sideways drift that afflicts vessels attempting to sail in any direction other than directly downwind. This resistance to leeway, as sailors term it, meant that Viking ships could make meaningful progress toward destinations that lay partially upwind, tacking back and forth across the wind in a series of diagonal courses that gradually brought them closer to their goal. And this capability was essential for the long ocean voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, where the prevailing winds could not always be relied upon to blow in convenient directions. The keel also served as the structural backbone of the entire vessel, the foundation to which the stems at bow and stern were joined, and from which the whole planking rose on either side, and the selection and shaping of this single timber required particular care, as any weakness or defect would compromise the integrity of the entire ship. Finding their way across the open ocean without the aid of magnetic compasses, which would not reach European waters until several centuries later, Viking navigators relied upon a combination of methods that modern sailors might find challenging, but which clearly proved effective given the scope of Norse exploration. When the sun was visible, experienced navigators could judge their latitude by observing its height above the horizon at midday, comparing what they saw to their memory of how the sun had appeared at the same time of day in familiar waters. And this rough but practical method allowed them to sail along lines of latitude with reasonable accuracy when conditions permitted. The sagas and other sources make reference to objects called sunstones, and for many years scholars debated whether these were mythical artifacts or actual navigational tools, but the current understanding suggests that they were crystals of Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite that has the peculiar optical property of polarizing light in a way that can reveal the position of the sun even when it is hidden behind clouds or fog. By looking through such a crystal and rotating it while observing how the light passing through changed in character, a skilled navigator could determine the direction from which the sunlight was coming, even when the sun itself was invisible, a technique that has been demonstrated to work in experimental conditions, and that would have been invaluable in the frequently overcast waters of the North Atlantic. Beyond such specialized tools, Norse sailors undoubtedly relied upon accumulated knowledge of landmarks, currents, the behavior of seabirds and marine mammals, the color and temperature of the water, and countless other subtle indicators that experience had taught them to interpret, building up a mental map of the ocean that served in place of the paper charts they did not possess. The capabilities of Viking ships have been tested in the modern era through the construction and sailing of full-scale replicas, the most ambitious of which was perhaps the Sea Stallion from Danelaw, a reconstruction of the largest of the Scandinavian ships based at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark. In the years 2007 and 2008, this replica undertook a voyage from Roskilde to Dublin, Ireland, following as closely as possible the route that the original vessel might have taken 1,000 years earlier. And the experiences of the crew during this journey provided invaluable insights into the practical realities of Viking-era seafaring. The voyage demonstrated both the remarkable performance of the ship design, which proved capable of speeds exceeding 10 knots under favorable sailing conditions, and the considerable physical demands placed upon the crew, who had to work continuously to manage the large sail, bail out water that inevitably found its way into the hull, and maintain the ship in good working order throughout weeks of sailing. The knowledge gained from this and similar replica voyages has transformed scholarly understanding of Viking maritime capabilities, moving the discussion from theoretical speculation to practical experience, and revealing both the achievements and the limitations of these medieval craft in ways that no amount of laboratory analysis could accomplish. The Scandinavian ships themselves, 5 vessels discovered in 1962 in the Roskilde Fjord of Denmark, deserve particular mention, for they represent a range of ship types that illustrates the diversity of Viking maritime technology. These ships had been deliberately sunk around the year 1070 as part of a barrier intended to protect the town of Roskilde from naval attack, their hulls filled with stones and allowed to settle into the shallow waters of the fjord, where they remained until archaeological investigation revealed their presence. The vessels ranged from a small fishing boat or ferry to the substantial warship upon which the Sea Stallion replica was based, and their varied designs reflect the specialized purposes for which they were intended, from coastal trade to ocean voyaging to military operations. Together with the Gokstad and Osberg ships, these Scandinavian vessels form the core body of evidence upon which our understanding of Viking shipbuilding rests, each one offering unique information about construction techniques, materials, and design choices that would otherwise be lost to history. The patient work of archaeologists, conservators, and maritime historians continues to reveal new details from these and other finds, gradually assembling a more complete picture of the technological achievements that made the Viking Age possible. And with that understanding comes a deeper appreciation for the skill and ingenuity of the anonymous shipwrights, whose masterworks of oak and iron carried the Norse across the waters of the world. And so we come now to a time when the Norse presence in the British Isles shifted from seasonal raiding to something altogether more permanent, when the longships brought not just warriors seeking quick plunder, but armies intent on conquest and settlement, when the very map of England would be redrawn to accommodate these newcomers from across the cold grey sea. This is the story of the great Heathen army, though we should note that the term Heathen was applied by the Christian chroniclers of the time, who viewed these invaders through the lens of religious difference, and it is a story that unfolds slowly, over decades, with all the complexity and messiness of real history, rather than the clean narrative arcs of legend. In the year 865, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a great host arrived on the shores of East Anglia, and this was not like the raids that had come before, not like the swift attacks on Lindisfarne or the seasonal harassment of coastal monasteries. This was an invasion force of considerable size, though we should be honest and say that medieval chroniclers were notoriously unreliable when it came to estimating the numbers of enemy forces, and figures given in the sources range from implausibly small to impossibly large. What we can say with more confidence is that this army was large enough to conquer kingdoms, well organized enough to sustain military campaigns over many years, and led by commanders of genuine strategic ability, who understood that England, fragmented into its various competing kingdoms, was vulnerable to a coordinated assault. The leaders of this great army were, according to later tradition, the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, that semi-mythical figure whose exploits had grown in the telling until it became difficult to separate the historical man, if indeed there was a single historical man behind the legends, from the composite hero of saga and song. Whether or not these men were truly sons of Ragnar, and whether or not their invasion was motivated by vengeance for their father's reported death in a Northumbrian snake pit, as the sagas would have us believe, we cannot say with certainty. What we know from the sources is that the army included commanders named Ivar, who was called the Boneless for reasons that remain unclear and much debated by historians, and Halfdan and Ubba, and that these men proved to be formidable military leaders whose campaigns would reshape the political geography of England. The army landed in East Anglia and, rather than immediately attacking, they negotiated with the local king, securing horses and supplies in exchange for a temporary peace. This was shrewd strategy, allowing them to transform from seaborne force into a mounted army capable of rapid movement across the English countryside. The Vikings were pragmatists above all else, and they understood that horses meant mobility, and mobility meant the ability to strike where their enemies were weakest, to outmaneuver the slower-moving Anglo-Saxon forces, to choose the time and place of their engagements. In 866, the army moved north into Northumbria, targeting the ancient city of York, which the Vikings would come to call Jorvik, and their timing demonstrated either remarkable intelligence gathering or extraordinary good fortune. They arrived on the 1st of November, which was All Saints' Day, a major feast day in the Christian calendar, when much of the Northumbrian population, including many of the warriors and nobility, would have been gathered in churches for worship. The city fell with relative ease, its defenders caught unprepared, its walls insufficient against a determined assault. The Northumbrian kings, who had been engaged in their own civil war, attempted to retake the city the following year, but were defeated and killed in the fighting, leaving Northumbria effectively under Viking control. From York, the army ranged across England, moving with a purposefulness that suggested they were working from a coherent strategic plan rather than simply raiding at random. They attacked Mercia. They returned to East Anglia. They wintered in various locations, always consolidating their gains, always keeping their enemies off balance. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, divided by their own rivalries and unused to facing such a sustained and coordinated threat, struggled to mount an effective resistance. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia, and here occurred one of the most famous episodes of the invasion, though we must acknowledge that our knowledge of these events comes primarily from hagiographical sources written long after the fact, sources that were more concerned with creating a saintly narrative than recording historical accuracy. King Edmund of East Anglia faced the Viking army and was defeated, captured, and killed. The later legends, particularly those recorded by Abbo of Fleury in the 10th century, describe his death in vivid detail. According to these accounts, Edmund was given the opportunity to save his life by renouncing his Christian faith and becoming a subordinate ruler under Viking overlordship, but he refused, choosing martyrdom over apostasy. He was tied to a tree and shot with arrows until, as the hagiographers put it. He resembled a hedgehog with its bristling quills, and then he was beheaded. How much of this account reflects historical reality, and how much reflects the conventions of hagiography, which required saints to die in particularly dramatic and edifying ways? We cannot say. What we can say is that Edmund was killed, that he was later venerated as a saint and martyr, and that his cult became one of the most significant in medieval England, with the town of Bury St Edmunds growing up around his shrine. The story of his death, whether accurate in its details or not, became part of the cultural memory of the invasion, a symbol of the suffering inflicted by the pagan Norse upon Christian England. As the decade of the 870s began, the great Heathen army had effectively conquered or neutralized 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria was under Viking control. East Anglia had been conquered and its king martyred, and Mercia had been reduced to a rump state, its eastern territories occupied by the invaders. Only Wessex, in the south and southwest of England, remained as a significant centre of Anglo-Saxon resistance, and it was here that the invasion would finally meet its match in the person of a young king named Alfred, who would later be called the Great, though we should note that this epithet was a later addition, not used during his own lifetime. Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, in the midst of crisis, and his early reign was characterized by a desperate struggle for survival against the Viking forces. The details of these campaigns are too numerous and complex to recount in full, but we can note that Alfred experienced both victories and defeats, that he was at times reduced to hiding in the marshes of Somerset with only a small band of followers, and that his ultimate success was by no means inevitable or predetermined. The famous story of Alfred burning the cakes while sheltering in a peasant's hut, lost in thought about the troubles of his kingdom, is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captures something of the desperation of this period, when the survival of Wessex, and with it the survival of an independent Anglo-Saxon England, hung in the balance. The turning point came in 878, when Alfred won a decisive victory at the Battle of Idington against the army led by Guthrum, who had emerged as one of the principal Viking leaders following the departure or death of the sons of Ragnar. Following this victory, Alfred and Guthrum negotiated a peace settlement that would have profound implications for the future of England. The Treaty of Wedmore, as it is sometimes called, though the actual terms were probably finalized in a subsequent agreement known as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, established a boundary between the territories controlled by Alfred and those controlled by the Vikings. This boundary ran roughly along the old Roman road known as Watling Street, from London to Chester, and the territory to the north and east of this line became known as the Danelaw, a term that reflected the fact that Danish, rather than English, law and custom prevailed in these regions. The Danelaw was not a unified kingdom, but rather a collection of territories under various Viking rulers, bound together by common origin and legal traditions, rather than by centralized political authority. Among the most important centers of the Danelaw were the 5 boroughs, a group of fortified towns that served as regional capitals and administrative centers. These were Leicester, and Nottingham, and Derby, and Stamford, and Lincoln, and each functioned as the focal point for a surrounding territory, with its own army and its own local leadership. The 5 boroughs would remain a distinctive feature of the Danelaw throughout its existence, and their influence can still be traced in the local dialects and place names of the East Midlands today. As part of the peace settlement, Guthrum agreed to accept baptism and to become a Christian, and Alfred himself stood as godfather at the ceremony, giving the former Viking warlord the Christian name Ethelstan. This was a significant moment, not just politically, but symbolically, as it represented the beginning of a process by which the Scandinavian settlers in England would gradually be assimilated into Christian, English-speaking society. Guthrum, now Ethelstan, ruled as King of East Anglia until his death in 890, and his coins from this period bear Christian symbols and his baptismal name, evidence of at least outward conformity to his new faith. Of all the Viking settlements in England, none flourished more remarkably than York, the city the Norse called Jorvik. Under Viking rule, York transformed from a relatively modest Anglo-Saxon town into one of the largest and most prosperous cities in Northern Europe, a major centre of trade and craft production, with a population that may have reached as many as 10,000 people at its peak. This was an enormous population by the standards of the time, comparable to the great cities of the continent, and it reflected York's position at the centre of trading networks that stretched from Ireland in the west to the Baltic in the east, from Scandinavia in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. Much of what we know about daily life in Viking York comes from the remarkable archaeological excavations conducted at Coppergate between 1976 and 1981. Coppergate, whose name derives from the Old Norse word for cupmakers, was a street of craftsmen and traders in the Viking period, and the waterlogged conditions at the site preserved organic materials that would normally have decayed long ago. The excavations revealed a densely packed urban landscape of timber buildings, workshops, and yards, where people lived and worked in close proximity, pursuing a wide variety of trades and crafts. Among the thousands of objects recovered from Coppergate were leather shoes and boots of various styles, some clearly designed for practical everyday use, and others showing signs of decorative stitching that suggests their owners cared about appearance as well as function. There were combs made from antler and bone, essential items of personal grooming in a society where long hair was common and the keeping of one's appearance was a matter of social significance. There were tools and waste materials from various crafts, evidence of woodworking and metalworking and textile production, of amberworking and jet carving, of all the busy industries that supported urban life. Perhaps the most spectacular find from the Coppergate excavations was a helmet of Anglo-Saxon manufacture, dating from the 8th century, which had somehow survived in the Viking Age deposits. The Coppergate helmet is one of only a handful of Anglo-Saxon helmets known to exist, and its presence in Viking York raises interesting questions about continuity and change, about what the Viking settlers preserved from the societies they conquered and what they discarded. The helmet shows no signs of having been modified or adapted, suggesting that it was valued as an object in its own right, perhaps as an heirloom or a trophy, a tangible connection to the past. The Coppergate excavations also revealed the less glamorous aspects of Viking urban life, the animal bones and food waste that tell us what people ate, the parasites and pathogens that tell us about the diseases they suffered, the accumulated debris of daily existence in a crowded, unsanitary city where people lived alongside their animals, and their refuse in a way that would seem unbearable to modern sensibilities. And yet these were people not so different from ourselves in their basic needs and desires. People who raised families and practiced trades and navigated the complexities of social life, who told stories and made music and wondered about the future, whose individual lives are mostly lost to us, but whose collective presence left traces that patient archaeology can still recover, more than 1,000 years later. And so we turn now to the quieter side of Viking life, the side that perhaps does not feature as prominently in the popular imagination, but which was every bit as important, and in many ways far more central to daily existence, than the raids and battles that tend to capture our attention. For while the Vikings were certainly capable warriors when circumstances demanded, they were also, and perhaps primarily, traders of remarkable sophistication, merchants who built vast commercial networks spanning thousands of miles, connecting the frozen north to the warm markets of the Mediterranean and beyond, to the great cities of the Islamic world, where silks and spices and silver coins flowed in quantities that would have seemed almost miraculous to those who first ventured forth from Scandinavian shores in search of profit and partnership. The Viking trading world can be understood through three main arteries of commerce, three great routes along which goods and people and ideas flowed with a regularity that speaks to careful organization and deep knowledge of geography. The first of these routes led westward, across the North Sea and the Irish Sea, to the kingdoms of Britain and Ireland, where Viking merchants established trading posts and market towns that would grow into some of the most important commercial centers of the medieval world. The second route led eastward, following the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, through lands of forest and steppe, all the way to the glittering cities of Byzantium and Baghdad, where northern furs and slaves could be exchanged for silver and silk, and objects of exquisite craftsmanship. And the third route was the Baltic network itself, a web of shorter journeys connecting the ports and islands of Scandinavia, the southern Baltic coast, and the lands of the Slavic peoples, forming a foundation of regional trade upon which the longer routes depended. Let us begin with the trading towns themselves, those remarkable settlements where commerce took precedence over agriculture, where people gathered not primarily to farm, but to buy and to sell, to craft and to exchange. Among the earliest and most significant of these was Birka, located on the small island of Björkö in Lake Mälarön, in what is now Sweden, founded around the year 750 of the Common Era, perhaps even slightly earlier, and flourishing for roughly 200 years before its eventual decline. Birka was not a large settlement by modern standards, nor even by the standards of contemporary Mediterranean cities, but it represented something new in Scandinavian society, a place dedicated to trade and craft production, where metalworkers and jewelers, bone carvers and textile workers plied their trades in close proximity to one another, creating goods for local consumption and for export to distant markets. The archaeological evidence from Birka is extensive and illuminating, including the remains of over 3,000 graves, which have provided researchers with detailed information about the lives and deaths of those who lived and worked there. These graves contain objects from across the known world: glass beads from the Middle East, silk from China, jewelry from the Frankish kingdoms, silver coins from the Arab caliphates, all testimony to the far-reaching connections that Birka's merchants maintained. The graves also reveal a socially diverse population, from wealthy traders buried with horses and weapons and fine clothing, to more modest individuals whose simpler burials nonetheless included objects of some value, suggesting that trade brought prosperity to many levels of society. Further south, on the base of the Jutland Peninsula in what is now northern Germany, lay another great trading center, the town known as Hedeby, or Heithabu in its Germanic spelling. Hedeby was larger than Birka, occupying a site of approximately 24 hectares, which is roughly equivalent to about 60 acres in the older measurement, and at its height it may have housed a population of around 1,500 permanent residents, with many more passing through as traders and travelers and seasonal visitors. The town was protected by a substantial semicircular rampart, and its harbour, sheltered and well positioned at the head of an inlet, could accommodate the shallow draft merchant vessels that plied the Baltic and North Sea trades. We are fortunate to possess a written account of Hedeby from an outside observer. The Arab traveller known as al-Tartushi, sometimes rendered as Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who visited the town around the year 950 of the Common Era as part of a diplomatic mission from the Caliphate of Córdoba in Spain. His description, preserved in later compilations, offers a glimpse of daily life in this busy commercial centre, and his observations range from the practical to the cultural. He noted the presence of a fresh water well in the centre of the town, and he described the prosperity of the inhabitants, who he said possessed considerable wealth. He also observed, with what seems to have been a certain dismay, that the singing of the inhabitants was quite poor, comparing it to the howling of dogs, only worse. This detail, so human and so unexpected in what is otherwise a fairly businesslike account, reminds us that these were real people living real lives, with their own musical traditions that simply did not accord with the refined tastes of a visitor from the sophisticated courts of Al-Andalus. The goods that flowed through these trading centres were remarkably diverse, reflecting the vast geographical range of Viking commercial activity. From the far north came furs of many kinds, the pelts of beaver and marten, fox and squirrel, bear and ermine, highly prized in southern markets where warm fur cloaks were marks of status and luxury. Walrus ivory was another valuable northern product, carved into luxury objects or exported in its raw form to workshops elsewhere, serving as an alternative to elephant ivory, which was often difficult to obtain in northern Europe. Amber, that fossilized tree resin found in great quantities along the Baltic shores, had been traded southward since prehistoric times, and the Vikings continued this ancient commerce, supplying the workshops of the Mediterranean world with raw material for jewelry and decorative objects. Honey and beeswax were important exports as well, used for sweetening, for making mead, and for the production of candles, which were essential for illuminating churches and noble households throughout Christian Europe. Weapons and metalwork of high quality were manufactured in Scandinavian workshops and traded to neighbouring peoples, while Frankish wine, produced in the vineyards of what is now France, made the reverse journey northward, satisfying the tastes of those wealthy enough to afford such imported luxuries. Iron, timber, grain, textiles, and countless other commodities moved through the trading networks, each item finding its way from producer to consumer through chains of exchange that might span dozens of intermediate transactions. And we must speak too of the slave trade, which was a significant and troubling part of Viking commerce, as it was indeed of most medieval economies. The people who were captured in raids, those unfortunate individuals seized from their homes in Britain and Ireland and the Slavic lands and elsewhere, were not always kept as personal servants by their captors, but were often sold onward to slave traders who transported them to markets where human beings were bought and sold like any other commodity. These enslaved people, known in Old Norse as thralls, were traded in markets from Dublin in the west, where the Vikings established a major slave trading centre, to Constantinople in the east, where the wealthy households of the Byzantine Empire created steady demand for domestic servants and labourers. The trade in human beings was particularly active along the eastern routes, where Scandinavian merchants, often called Russ by the peoples they encountered, moved goods and slaves southward along the great rivers, the Volkhov and the Dnieper and the Volga, to the markets of the Khazar Khaganate and the Abbasid Caliphate. Arabic sources speak of these northern traders and the human cargo they brought, describing the prices paid for different types of slaves and the conditions under which they were transported and sold. It is a dark chapter in the history of Viking commerce, yet one that cannot be omitted if we are to understand the full nature of their trading activities and the economic forces that drove their expansion across such vast distances. The profits of this far-ranging trade can be measured, in part, by the remarkable quantities of silver that flowed into Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Silver, in the form of coins and ingots and arm rings, was the lifeblood of the Viking economy, used not merely for hoarding, but as a medium of exchange, often cut into small pieces and weighed on portable scales to make precise payments. The most common source of this silver was the Arab world, where rich mines in Central Asia and elsewhere produced the dirhams that circulated throughout the Islamic caliphates and beyond. Over 80,000 of these Arabic silver coins have been discovered in Scandinavian hoards, buried for safekeeping and never recovered by their original owners, a number that speaks to the immense volume of trade that connected the Baltic world to the markets of Baghdad and Samarkand. The largest of all these hoards was discovered in 1999 on the island of Gotland, at a site called Spillings, by a farmer who noticed something glinting in the soil of his field. Excavation revealed a treasure of astonishing size: 67 kilograms of silver, the largest Viking Age silver hoard ever found. The collection included silver coins from many lands, dirhams from the Arab world, and coins from other mints, along with silver arm rings and ingots and cut fragments, all apparently buried in the early 9th century and left undisturbed for over 1,000 years. The Spillings hoard reminds us that the wealth flowing into Scandinavia was not merely historical abstraction, but tangible, physical metal, heavy and gleaming, accumulated through countless transactions across many years. The eastward routes that brought this silver to Scandinavia are among the most remarkable achievements of Viking Age commerce. The Volga trade route, in particular, stretched for thousands of miles, from the Baltic coast through the heartland of what is now Russia, following the great river southward to the Caspian Sea and the markets of the Khazar capital at Itil, from which connections led further still to the cities of the Abbasid Caliphate. Viking merchants, or Russ as they were known in these lands, established trading posts and seasonal camps along this route, navigating the rivers in specially designed boats that could be portaged overland when necessary, dragged on log rollers from one waterway to the next. We possess a particularly vivid account of these Russ traders from the pen of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered a group of them in the year 921 of the Common Era while on a mission to the king of the Volga Bulgars. Ibn Fadlan was both fascinated and horrified by these northern visitors, and his detailed description provides invaluable evidence for Viking practices and beliefs. He described their physical appearance, noting that they were tall and fair, that they wore cloaks and carried axes and swords, and that the women wore ornate brooches and necklaces of glass beads, the number of which indicated their husbands' wealth. He observed their commercial activities, the way they prayed to their gods for successful sales, and the rituals they performed when a chieftain died, including a ship burial of considerable elaboration. Ibn Fadlan's account, preserved in manuscript copies that have survived the centuries, offers a window into a world of cultural encounter, where traders from the frozen north met merchants from the warm lands of Islam, exchanging not only goods, but also ideas and practices and impressions of one another. The Rus, whom Ibn Fadlan observed, were far from home, operating at the extreme end of a trading network that stretched back to the familiar harbours of Burka and Hedeby. Yet they were clearly experienced in their profession, comfortable in this foreign environment, conducting their business with the confidence of men who knew the value of what they had brought and what they hoped to acquire. And so the picture that emerges, as we consider the Viking trading world, is one of sophisticated commercial activity, of careful planning and accumulated knowledge, of risks taken and fortunes made, of goods flowing across vast distances through networks maintained by trust and mutual advantage. The Vikings were not merely raiders who took what they wanted by force, though they were certainly capable of doing so when circumstances favored such action, but were also merchants of considerable skill, traders who built and maintained commercial relationships across cultural and religious boundaries, connecting the peoples of Northern Europe to the wider world in ways that would shape the development of medieval commerce for centuries to come. And now we turn our attention eastward, away from the familiar coastlines of Britain and Francia, away from the windswept islands of the North Atlantic, and toward the vast river systems that thread through the forests and marshlands of what we now call Eastern Europe. For while their Danish and Norwegian cousins were carving out kingdoms in the west, the Swedish Vikings, known to history as the Varangians, were quietly forging pathways of their own, following the great rivers southward and eastward, establishing trading networks that would stretch from the Baltic Sea all the way to the glittering walls of Constantinople. And in doing so, they would lay the foundations for what would eventually become the Russian state itself. The rivers were everything to these Eastern adventurers, and we must take a moment to appreciate just how different this landscape was from the open seas that carried longships to Lindisfarne or Iceland. Here in the east, the waterways served as highways through otherwise impenetrable terrain, dense forests of birch and pine giving way to endless marshes and soggy lowlands, where overland travel was slow, exhausting, and often impossible for much of the year. The Varangians learned to read these rivers the way their western counterparts read the stars and currents of the open ocean, and they developed boats and techniques suited to this particular challenge. Vessels that were lighter and more portable than the great ocean-going longships, craft that could be carried overland when the rivers became too shallow or too violent to navigate. The two great arteries of this eastern expansion were the Dnieper and the Volga rivers, each offering its own route to distant markets, and each presenting its own unique difficulties. The Dnieper flowed southward to the Black Sea, and ultimately to the Byzantine Empire, that continuation of the Roman world that the Norsemen called Miklagard, meaning simply the Great City, a name that conveys something of the awe these northern travellers must have felt when they first glimpsed the walls of Constantinople rising above the waters. The Volga, meanwhile, curved eastward and then southward to the Caspian Sea, opening trade routes to the Islamic world, to the cities of Persia and the markets of Baghdad, where Arab merchants traded in silks and spices and silver that would eventually find its way back to Scandinavia in quantities that astonish archaeologists to this day. Our understanding of how these Varangians came to establish themselves in the lands of the Eastern Slavs depends heavily upon a document known as the Primary Chronicle, also called the Tale of Bygone Years, a compilation of historical accounts that was written down in the early 12th century by monks in Kiev. This chronicle tells us that in the year 862 AD, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the region, who had been paying tribute to the Varangians, but had recently expelled them, found themselves unable to govern their own affairs peacefully. According to the Chronicle, these tribes then sent messengers across the Baltic Sea with a remarkable invitation, asking the Varangians to come and rule over them, saying that their land was great and rich, but that there was no order in it, and requesting that the Varangians come to be princes over them. 3 brothers reportedly answered this call, the eldest being a man named Rurik, who established himself at a place called Novgorod, and from Rurik, the Chronicle tells us, descended the dynasty that would rule the Russian lands for more than 7 centuries. Now we must approach this account with the gentle skepticism that historians apply to all such founding legends. For the primary chronicle was written more than 200 years after the events it describes, and medieval chroniclers had their own reasons for presenting the past in particular ways, whether Rurik was a historical figure, and whether he truly arrived by invitation rather than conquest, are questions that continue to generate thoughtful debate among scholars. What seems clear from the archaeological evidence is that Scandinavian traders and warriors were indeed establishing themselves in this region during the 9th century, and that they played some significant role in the political consolidation that followed, though the exact nature of their relationship with the local Slavic population remains a matter of ongoing research. The very name by which these eastern lands came to be known may itself preserve a trace of this Scandinavian presence. For the word Russ, from which we derive Russia, has been connected by some scholars to the Old Norse term Roths or Ruthsmen, meaning a rowing crew, a band of men who pull oars together on a ship. This etymology would suggest that the people who gave their name to Russia were originally identified by their manner of travelling as oarsmen on boats, which fits rather neatly with what we know of how the Varangians made their way through these river systems. Other scholars have proposed different origins for the name, connecting it to various Finnish or Slavic roots, and the question has not been definitively settled. But there is something pleasing about the idea that one of the largest nations on Earth might bear a name that originally meant simply the rowing people, a quiet reminder of those boats pulling their way upstream against the current, century after century ago. To travel from the Baltic Sea to Constantinople along the Dnieper route was an undertaking of truly extraordinary difficulty, a journey of approximately 1,700 kilometers that required not merely sailing and rowing, but also the laborious process of portaging, which means carrying or dragging boats overland around obstacles that could not be navigated. Along the Dnieper alone, there were more than 70 such portages required, places where rapids churned the water into impassable foam, where waterfalls blocked the way entirely, or where the river simply became too shallow for even the lightest draft. At these points, the Varangians had to unload their cargo, carry it along the riverbank, and then either carry their boats as well or drag them on rollers cut from local timber, all while remaining alert to the possibility of ambush by hostile tribes who understood that men burdened with goods and boats made vulnerable targets. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine Vicethant, writing in the 10th century, left us a detailed description of this journey and its dangers, naming several of the most treacherous rapids and describing how the Rus traders navigated each obstacle. He tells us of places where the boats had to be guided through narrow channels, while some men walked along the bank, steadying the vessel with poles, and other places where the entire operation had to come ashore and proceed overland for considerable distances. It is a portrait of commerce conducted through sheer determination, of profits earned not merely through clever trading, but through physical endurance, logistical planning, and the willingness to undertake journeys that would have seemed impossible to merchants of more settled civilizations. Those who completed this journey and reached Constantinople found themselves in the greatest city of the medieval world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people protected by walls that had never been breached by any foreign army, adorned with churches and palaces and public buildings that represented the accumulated wealth of centuries. The Byzantines viewed these northern traders with a mixture of wariness and pragmatic appreciation, for the Rus brought furs and slaves and honey and wax that Byzantine merchants valued, and they were clearly formidable warriors who might prove useful in the right circumstances. In the year 988 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Basil the So formalized this relationship by creating an elite military unit composed entirely of these Varangian warriors, a personal guard that would serve the emperors faithfully for more than 2 centuries. The Varangian Guard quickly became the most prestigious military unit in the Byzantine Empire, feared by enemies and envied by other soldiers, serving as a kind of ceremonial bodyguard during peacetime and as shock troops during military campaigns. These men were paid well. They were allowed to keep a share of the plunder from their battles, and they enjoyed the privilege of being permitted to raid the imperial treasury upon the death of an emperor, taking whatever they could carry in their own 2 hands. Service in the Varangian Guard became so sought after that young Scandinavian warriors traveled to Constantinople specifically to enlist, spending years or even decades in the emperor's service before returning home with wealth and stories that elevated their status immensely. Perhaps the most famous of all Varangian guardsmen was a Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada, meaning Harold the Hard Ruler, who arrived in Constantinople around 1034 AD after fleeing political troubles in his homeland. Harold served in the Guard for approximately a decade, fighting in campaigns across the Mediterranean, in Sicily and Bulgaria, and the lands of the eastern frontier, accumulating enormous wealth and gaining a reputation for both tactical brilliance and personal ferocity. He eventually departed Constantinople under somewhat murky circumstances, possibly having fallen out of imperial favor, and made his way back to Scandinavia, where he eventually became King of Norway. His career would end, as we have discussed elsewhere, on the field of Stamford Bridge in 1066. But his years in the Varangian Guard represent the remarkable range of possibilities that were open to an ambitious Viking in this era. A curious memorial to the Varangian presence in the Mediterranean survives today in a rather unexpected location. For in the city of Venice, in the courtyard of the arsenal, there stands a large marble lion that was originally erected at the harbour of Piraeus in Greece, the ancient port of Athens. This lion was brought to Venice as a trophy in the late 17th century, and at some point scholars noticed that its shoulders bear carved inscriptions in runic characters, the alphabet of the Scandinavians. The inscriptions have been worn almost smooth by time and are extremely difficult to read, but they appear to be graffiti carved by Varangian guardsmen, perhaps commemorating a fallen comrade or simply recording their presence in this foreign land, much as modern tourists might carve their initials on a tree or scratch their names into wet concrete. The idea of these northern warriors standing before this ancient Greek monument in the warm Mediterranean sun, taking the time to scratch messages in their own script, is a quietly moving reminder of how far from home they had traveled. The relationship between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire was not always peaceful, and the chronicles record several occasions when the northerners came, not as traders or mercenaries, but as raiders, attacking Constantinople itself in hopes of plundering its legendary wealth. The most dramatic of these attacks occurred in the year 860 AD, when a fleet of approximately 200 ships appeared suddenly in the waters before the city, catching the Byzantines entirely by surprise, while their emperor was away on campaign. The Rus raiders devastated the suburbs and the coastal regions, destroying churches and carrying off considerable plunder, and for a time, it seemed that the city itself might fall. According to Byzantine sources, the city was saved when the Patriarch led a procession carrying the robe of the Virgin Mary along the walls, and a great storm subsequently scattered the attacking fleet, though more skeptical historians might suggest that the raiders simply withdrew after having taken sufficient plunder. The archaeological evidence for this Varangian presence in the east is substantial and continues to grow as new sites are excavated and analysed. One of the most significant is the Gniezdovo archaeological complex, located near the modern city of Smolensk in Russia, which contains more than 3,000 burial mounds dating primarily to the 10th century. Excavations here have revealed a remarkable mixture of Scandinavian and Slavic material culture, with some graves containing weapons and ornaments of clearly Norse origin, while others show more local traditions, suggesting a community where these different peoples lived and worked and were eventually buried side by side. The sheer scale of the cemetery indicates that this was a major settlement, likely an important trading station along the route from the Baltic to the south. We are fortunate to possess an eyewitness account of the Rus that comes not from Byzantine or Scandinavian sources, but from the Islamic world. For in the year 921 AD, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled to the Volga region as part of an embassy from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Ibn Fadlan kept detailed notes of his journey and the peoples he encountered, and his description of the Rus, whom he met along the Volga River, remains one of our most vivid contemporary portraits of these northern traders. He describes them as physically impressive, tall and fair, with bodies covered in decorative tattoos, and he notes both their elaborate personal grooming habits and what he considered their somewhat unsanitary communal practices. Most memorably, Ibn Fadlan provides an extended description of a ship burial that he witnessed, a ceremony in which a deceased chieftain was placed in his boat along with weapons, food, animals, and a sacrificed slave girl, and the entire vessel was then set ablaze. His account is detailed and at times disturbing, describing the rituals that preceded the cremation with an anthropologist's eye for detail and a diplomat's awareness that he was observing customs very different from his own. This description has proven invaluable to archaeologists seeking to understand the fragmentary remains they uncover in burial mounds. For Ibn Fadlan tells us not merely what objects were included, but how they were arranged, what words were spoken, and what meanings the participants attached to the various elements of the ritual. And so we can begin to see the outlines of this Varangian world, this network of traders and warriors who followed the rivers eastward and southward, who established settlements among the Slavs and Finns, who traded with the Byzantines and sometimes attacked them, who served emperors as loyal guardsmen and carved their names in runes on Greek statues, who were described by Arab diplomats and buried beneath the mounds that still dot the landscape of Western Russia. They were not conquerors in the manner of the great Heathen army that descended upon England, nor explorers in the manner of those who settled Iceland and reached the shores of North America, but they were engaged in their own kind of expansion, one measured in trade routes and tribute networks rather than in territories held and kingdoms founded. And yet, from their activities, from the dynasty that Rurik supposedly established, there would eventually emerge something larger, a political entity that would grow and consolidate over the centuries, absorbing Byzantine Christianity and its artistic traditions, developing its own literature and law, until it became recognizable as Russia itself. The rivers that the Varangians navigated with such difficulty would become the arteries of an empire, and the trading posts they established would grow into great cities, and the name that may have meant simply the rowing crew would come to designate one of the most consequential nations in human history. But that is a story that extends far beyond our gentle chronicle of the Viking Age, and for now, we may simply note that the eastern expansion of the Scandinavians, though less celebrated in popular imagination than the raids on Western monasteries or the voyages across the North Atlantic, was in its own way equally remarkable, equally consequential, and equally deserving of our quiet contemplation as the evening deepens and the mind begins its own gentle journey toward rest. And so we come now to the edges of the known world, to those places where the sea stretched out into grey uncertainty, and where the boldest of the Norse voyagers would eventually make their homes, in lands of ice and fire and long winter darkness. This is a quieter chapter in some ways, a story of settlement rather than raid, of families loading their belongings onto ships and sailing toward horizons that promised nothing certain, only the possibility of land and freedom and a life made by their own hands. Let us begin with Iceland, that remarkable island that sits alone in the North Atlantic, formed by volcanic fires rising from the ocean floor, a place where hot springs steam beside glaciers and where the summer sun barely sets at all. The Norse were not, it must be said, the first to find this island. Before them came the Irish monks, those wandering hermits known as the Papa, who sought solitude and communion with their god in the most remote places they could reach. These monks arrived in their small boats, perhaps curraghs made of leather stretched over wooden frames, and they established small communities on the Icelandic coast, living simply and praying in the endless summer light. We know relatively little about them, these quiet predecessors, but the Norse settlers who came later found traces of their presence, small bells and books, and the remains of humble dwellings. The monks did not stay long after the Norse arrived, for they had come seeking isolation, and the new settlers brought with them a very different kind of world, full of livestock and longhouses, and the busy noise of permanent habitation. The traditional date given for the first permanent Norse settlement in Iceland is the year 874, and the man credited with establishing it was a Norwegian named Ingolf Arnason. The story tells us that as he approached the Icelandic coast, he threw the wooden pillars from his high seat overboard, a custom of the time, vowing to settle wherever they washed ashore. It took his slaves some 3 years to find where the pillars had landed, and when they did, the place was a small bay on the southwestern coast, a site that Ingolfur named Reykjavik, which means Smoke Bay or Bay of Smokes, likely a reference to the steam rising from the geothermal springs in the area. This same spot would grow over the centuries to become the capital city of Iceland, though in those early days it was simply one farmstead, among many, that would soon dot the Icelandic landscape. What followed Ingolfur's settlement was a period known as the Age of Settlement, or landnám in Old Norse, during which families from Norway and the Norse colonies in Britain and Ireland made their way to Iceland in considerable numbers. This migration lasted roughly 60 years, from about 870 to 930, and it was meticulously recorded in a remarkable document called the Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements. This text, compiled and revised over several centuries, records the names and origins of more than 400 original settlers, along with descriptions of the land they claimed and the families they founded. It is an extraordinary piece of historical documentation, allowing us to trace the founding generations of Icelandic society with a specificity rare for this period of medieval history. The Landnámabók tells us of chieftains and farmers, of freed slaves and Irish wives, of the plots of land measured by how far a woman could walk leading a cow on a spring day, or by how far a man could carry fire between sunrise and sunset. The settlers who came to Iceland were often those seeking to escape the increasingly centralized power of King Harald Fairhair in Norway. Men and women who valued their independence and were willing to endure considerable hardship to preserve it. They brought with them their animals, their tools, their household goods, and their social customs, establishing a society that was in many ways remarkably free and self-governing. By the year 930, Iceland had established the Althing, a general assembly that met annually at a place called Thingvellir, a natural amphitheatre formed by the rift between two tectonic plates. There, free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and conduct the business of their society, creating what some historians consider one of the earliest parliamentary institutions in the world. But that is a story for another time. And for now, we need only note that Iceland became a thriving Norse society, a place where the sagas would be composed and where the traditions of the Old Norse world would be carefully preserved, even as Christianity came to transform them. Among the settlers who came to Iceland were people of complicated histories, individuals who had fled trouble or caused it, who were looking for second chances or simply for land that was not yet claimed by others. One such figure was a man named Erik, who would come to be known as Erik the Red, likely due to the colour of his hair and beard. Erik's father, Thorvald, had left Norway because of what the sources describe as some killings, a phrase that suggests the family was no stranger to violence and its consequences. They settled in northwestern Iceland, but Erik himself was eventually banished from that district as well, again because of killings, and he moved to another part of Iceland, to the islands of Breiðafjörð. There too, he became embroiled in disputes, this time over borrowed household items and a violent confrontation that resulted in the deaths of several men. The Althing sentenced Erik to 3 years of outlawry, meaning he could not remain in Iceland for that period, and anyone who killed him during his banishment would face no legal penalty. It was this sentence that drove Erik westward, toward rumours of land that had been glimpsed by earlier sailors blown off course. In the year 982, Erik set sail with his household and followers to find this land, to explore it, and perhaps to establish a place where he might make a fresh start. He spent his 3 years of banishment exploring the southwestern coast of an enormous island, finding deep fjords that reminded him of home, finding meadows that turned green in the brief summer, finding a landscape that was harsh but not impossible. When his term of banishment ended and he returned to Iceland, Erik needed to convince others to join him in settling this new land. And here he demonstrated what we might today call a flair for marketing. He named the place Greenland, despite the fact that it was considerably more icy than Iceland itself, reasoning that people would be more eager to go there if it had an attractive name. The sagas record this quite explicitly, noting that Erik called it Greenland because he said people would be attracted to go there if it had a good name. In the year 985, Erik led a fleet of 25 ships from Iceland toward Greenland, though only 14 of those ships completed the journey, the others having turned back or been lost to the sea. The survivors established 2 main settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast, in the relatively sheltered fjords where the land was most hospitable. These came to be known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, though they were actually both on the western coast, with the Eastern Settlement being the more southerly of the two, and the Western Settlement lying further north along the coast. Over the following decades, these settlements grew to include perhaps 5,000 inhabitants at their peak, a remarkable population for such a remote and challenging environment. The settlers brought with them the agricultural practices they knew from Iceland and Scandinavia, raising cattle, sheep, and goats in the narrow valleys, cutting hay in the summer to sustain their animals through the long winters. Erik himself established a farm called Brattahlid, which means steep slope, at the head of a fjord in the Eastern Settlement, and this became the center of Greenland's Norse society. Archaeological excavations at Brattahlid have revealed much about how the Greenland Norse lived, including the remains of a small church that holds a touching story. According to the sagas, Erik's wife, Thiodhild, converted to Christianity and demanded that a church be built for her, though Erik himself remained attached to the old gods. She built the church at some distance from the main farmhouse, and the sagas add that after her conversion, she refused to share a bed with her pagan husband, which caused him considerable annoyance. The archaeological remains of this tiny church were discovered in 1961, a building so small that it could hold perhaps 20 or 30 worshippers, its walls built of turf in the manner of the Greenland Norse, a humble structure that nevertheless represents the arrival of Christianity at the very edge of European settlement. The Greenland Norse survived through a combination of farming and hunting, but their most valuable connection to the wider world came through trade in luxury goods that could not be obtained elsewhere in the medieval European economy. Most important was walrus ivory, harvested from the walrus colonies that existed further north along the Greenland coast. This ivory was valued nearly as highly as elephant ivory, and it was used throughout medieval Europe for carved religious objects, gaming pieces, and decorative items. The Greenland Norse also traded in polar bear furs, a rarity that commanded high prices, and in live gyrfalcons, those magnificent Arctic hunting birds that were prized above all others by European nobility. A single white gyrfalcon could be worth more than its weight in gold, and the right to hunt and trade in these birds was a valuable privilege. These goods flowed from Greenland to Norway and thence to the rest of Europe, connecting this remote outpost to the broader medieval economy and providing the settlers with the imported goods they could not produce themselves, things like iron, timber, grain, and church furnishings. But the Greenland settlements were always fragile, always dependent on a narrow margin of survival in a challenging environment. And by the 15th century, the Norse presence in Greenland had come to an end, though the exact circumstances of this ending remain partially mysterious. The last written record of the Greenland Norse comes from 1408, when a marriage was recorded at the church in the Eastern Settlement, and after that, silence. When European explorers returned to Greenland in later centuries, they found the settlements abandoned, the buildings empty, the farms returned to wilderness. Scholars have proposed various explanations for the disappearance of the Greenland Norse, and the truth likely involves a combination of factors acting together. The climate of the North Atlantic grew colder during the 14th and 15th centuries, a period sometimes called the Little Ice Age, and this would have shortened growing seasons, reduced crop yields, and made the sea journeys to and from Greenland more dangerous. The walrus ivory trade, which had sustained the Greenland economy, faced competition from elephant ivory that became more available through African trade routes, reducing the value of Greenland's primary export. The Black Death, which devastated Norway in the middle of the 14th century, may have disrupted the shipping connections that linked Greenland to Europe, leaving the settlers increasingly isolated. And the Greenland Norse also came into contact with the Inuit peoples, who were expanding southward along the Greenland coast during this period, peoples who were far better adapted to Arctic conditions and who may have competed for the same marine resources. A remarkable archaeological discovery at a site called Herjolfsnes in the eastern settlement has given us a poignant glimpse into the final generations of the Greenland Norse. There, in the frozen ground of a churchyard, researchers found the preserved bodies of Norse settlers, their medieval clothing intact due to the cold conditions. The garments showed that the Greenland Norse were still following European fashions, even in their isolation, wearing hoods and gowns in styles that were current in late medieval Scandinavia. But the bodies themselves told a more troubling story, showing signs of malnutrition and hardship, suggesting that the final years of the Greenland settlement were years of struggle and deprivation. The people buried at Herjolfsnes died far from the centers of medieval civilization, at the very edge of the known world, their communities slowly fading as the connections to their homeland weakened and the climate turned against them. And so the Greenland settlements passed into history, a remarkable experiment in human adaptation that lasted nearly 500 years before finally succumbing to forces beyond the settlers' control. The ruins of their farms and churches remain in the Greenland fjords, slowly being excavated and studied, telling their quiet stories to those patient enough to listen. The Norse who settled Iceland and Greenland pushed the boundaries of their world to their very limits, establishing communities in places that seemed barely capable of supporting human life, demonstrating both the remarkable adaptability of medieval Scandinavian society and the ultimate vulnerability of settlements at the margins of what was possible. Long before the name Columbus would echo through the corridors of European history, and many generations before the Spanish caravels would set their sails toward what they believed to be the westward route to Asia, there lived a young Norse explorer whose quiet voyage across the cold grey waters of the North Atlantic would place Scandinavian feet upon American soil for the very first time. His name was Leif, the son of Erik the Red, and his journey took place around the year 1000 in the Common Era, a full 5 centuries before the more famous voyages that would eventually reshape the world's understanding of geography. The story of Leif Erikson and the Norse discovery of America is one that unfolds gently across the pages of medieval manuscripts, through the patient work of archaeologists, and in the quiet confirmation of scientific analysis, all of which together paint a picture of brief contact between two worlds that would not meet again for nearly half a millennium. The tale begins, as so many Norse tales do, with the restless movement of people across the northern seas. For the Vikings were a people accustomed to following the horizon wherever it might lead them. Leif Erikson was born sometime around the year 970, likely in Iceland, to Erik Thorvaldsson, the man who would become known to history as Erik the Red on account of his red hair and perhaps also his fiery temperament. Erik had been exiled from Iceland for a period of 3 years following a series of violent disputes, and during this exile he sailed westward to explore a large island that had been sighted by earlier sailors blown off course. Finding the southwestern coast of this island to be suitable for settlement, Erik gave it the optimistic name of Greenland, hoping that a pleasant name might encourage others to join him there. When his exile ended, Erik returned to Iceland and gathered colonists to accompany him back to this new land, establishing the eastern settlement around the year 985. It was in this remote Norse outpost, perched on the edge of the known world, that Leif Erikson grew to manhood and eventually heard stories that would inspire his own westward voyage. The primary sources that tell us of Leif Erikson's discovery of America are two medieval Icelandic texts known collectively as the Vinland sagas, and these remarkable documents, though written down some 2 centuries after the events they describe, preserve the oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of Norse families. The first of these is called the Saga of the Greenlanders, which was probably composed in the early 13th century and is generally considered to provide the more reliable account of the discovery. The second is known as Erik the Red's Saga, which was written somewhat later and presents a slightly different version of events, giving more prominence to a later explorer named Thorfinn Karlsefni. While these 2 sagas do not agree on every detail, and while scholars have spent many patient hours comparing their accounts and weighing their relative merits, together they provide a consistent picture of Norse voyages to the eastern coast of North America around the turn of the 1st millennium. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, Leif Erikson set out from Greenland around the year 1000 with a crew of 35 men, sailing westward in search of lands that had been glimpsed by an earlier voyager named Bjarni Hjörjolfsson, who had been blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland and had sighted unfamiliar coastlines, but had not gone ashore to explore them. Leif, being of a more curious disposition, wished to see these lands for himself, and so he purchased Bjarni's ship and assembled a crew for the journey. The saga tells us that Leif sailed westward and eventually came upon a land of flat stones and glaciers, which he found so barren and uninviting that he named it Helluland, meaning the land of flat stones. Modern scholars believe this to have been Baffin Island, that vast and rocky landmass that lies across the Davis Strait from Greenland. Continuing southward along the coast, Leif next came upon a land of forests and white sandy beaches, which he named Markland, meaning the land of forests, and this is generally identified with the coast of Labrador. Still sailing south, Leif and his men eventually reached a more temperate region where they decided to make camp for the winter, and it was here that they found wild grapes growing, which led Leif to name this place Vinland, meaning the land of wine. The sagas describe Vinland as a pleasant land with mild winters, abundant salmon, and grass that remained green for much of the year, a description that suggests a climate considerably warmer than that of Greenland or Iceland. After spending the winter in Vinland, Leif and his crew returned to Greenland with a cargo of timber and dried grapes, valuable commodities in that tree-poor land. Leif himself never returned to Vinland, but his voyage inspired others in the small Greenland colony to attempt their own expeditions to the lands he had discovered. The sagas tell of voyages by Leif's brother Thorvald, who was killed in a conflict with the indigenous inhabitants, and by his sister-in-law Gudrid and her husband Thorfinn Karlsefni, who made the most ambitious attempt at permanent colonization. For many centuries, the Vinland sagas were regarded by most historians as little more than legend, entertaining tales that might contain a kernel of historical truth, but could not be verified by any archaeological evidence. This scholarly skepticism changed dramatically in the year 1960, when a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad, who was an archaeologist, discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at a place called Lands Ork Meadows on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in Canada. Helge Ingstad had spent years searching the eastern coast of North America for traces of the Norse presence. Guided by his careful reading of the sagas and his understanding of Norse sailing routes and settlement patterns, when he arrived at the small fishing village of Lands och Meadows, a local resident named George Decker showed him a series of grass-covered ridges near the shore that the locals had long believed to be the remains of an old Native American camp. Ingstad immediately recognized the distinctive outline of Norse longhouses in these ridges, and over the following 8 years, he and his wife led a series of archaeological excavations that would transform our understanding of the Viking Age. The excavations at Lands och Meadows revealed the remains of 8 buildings constructed in the distinctive Norse style, including 3 large halls that could have housed between 70 and 90 people, as well as smaller structures that served as workshops and a forge. The presence of a forge was particularly significant, for the indigenous peoples of the region did not work iron, and the discovery of iron slag, iron rivets, and a bronze cloak pin of Norse design provided clear evidence that Europeans had lived at this site. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the site, including wood, bone, and charcoal coal, consistently pointed to an occupation date of around the year 1000, precisely the period described in the Vinland sagas. Perhaps most intriguing of all was the discovery of butternuts and butternut wood at Lands och Meadows. For butternut trees do not grow as far north as Newfoundland, and their presence at the site indicates that the Norse inhabitants must have traveled farther south, perhaps to the region of New Brunswick or the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and brought these nuts back with them. This finding suggests that the Norse explored a considerable stretch of the North American coastline, and that the Vinland of the sagas may have referred not to a single location, but to a broader region. In recognition of its extraordinary historical significance as the only confirmed Norse site in North America, and as evidence of the first known European presence in the New World, Lands och Meadow was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the year 1978. The site remains to this day a place of quiet pilgrimage for those interested in the long and complex history of human exploration. A windswept headland where the remains of sod walls and hearths speak silently of a brief moment of contact between 2 hemispheres that would not meet again for 500 years. The most ambitious attempt to establish a permanent Norse presence in Vinland was led by a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who sailed from Greenland around the year 1010 with approximately 160 settlers, including both men and women, as well as livestock and supplies for establishing a new colony. Among those who accompanied Karlsefni was Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, the widow of Leif Erikson's brother Thorstein, who had married Karlsefni and was now pregnant with their first child. The expedition established a settlement in Vinland, and it was there that Gudrid gave birth to a son whom they named Snorri Thorfinnsson, a child who holds the distinction of being the first European known to have been born in North America. The colonists remained in Vinland for approximately 3 years, during which time they encountered the indigenous inhabitants of the region, whom the Norse called Skrælings, a term that appears to have been used somewhat loosely for any non-Norse peoples. The sagas describe initial trading encounters between the Norse and the Skrælings, during which the indigenous people showed great interest in the red cloth and milk that the Norse offered. But these peaceful interactions eventually gave way to violent conflict. The exact causes of this hostility are not entirely clear from the sources, but it seems that cultural misunderstandings and perhaps competition for resources led to battles that the small Norse settlement could not sustain. Outnumbered and far from any source of reinforcement, Karlsefni and his colonists eventually decided to abandon their settlement and return to Greenland, bringing with them timber, furs, and the young Snorri, who would grow up to become the ancestor of several prominent Icelandic families, including, according to later genealogies, several medieval bishops. The failure of Karlsefni's colony appears to have discouraged further attempts at large-scale settlement, though the sagas mention occasional voyages to Markland to obtain timber for the wood-poor settlements of Greenland. Beyond the archaeological evidence of Landsog meadows, there are other tantalizing hints of Norse presence or influence in North America. In 1957, at a Native American archaeological site called the Goddard Site in the state of Maine, a small silver coin was discovered among a collection of artifacts that included stone tools and other objects, typical of indigenous cultures of the region. This coin, which has come to be known as the Maine penny, was identified as a Norwegian coin minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, who ruled Norway from 1067 to 1093. How this single Norse coin came to be deposited at a Native American site in Maine remains a matter of scholarly debate, for the Goddard site shows no other evidence of direct Norse presence, and it is generally believed that the coin must have reached Maine through indigenous trade networks, passing from hand to hand along routes that connected the peoples of the northeastern coast with those who lived farther north, where contact with Norse Greenlanders was more likely. The Maine penny serves as a small but evocative reminder that the boundaries between cultures are often more permeable than we might imagine, and that objects can travel far beyond the people who made them. In recent years, scientific techniques have provided new ways of dating the Norse presence in North America with remarkable precision. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study that used a novel method based on the traces left in tree rings by a massive solar storm that occurred in the year 993. This solar storm, which would have been visible as an unusually bright aurora, left a distinctive spike in the amount of radiocarbon present in the atmosphere, and this spike was incorporated into the wood of trees growing at that time by examining wood from lands, og meadows that showed clear marks of having been cut with metal tools, and by counting the tree rings between the growth layer containing the solar storm signature and the outer edge of the wood where cutting had occurred. The researchers were able to determine that the trees had been felled in the year 1021, providing the first precise calendar date for the Norse presence in the Americas. This date of 1021 aligns well with the chronology suggested by the Vinland sagas, and confirms that Norse settlers were indeed living on the shores of Newfoundland a full 471 years before Columbus made his first voyage across the Atlantic. The Norse discovery of America, though remarkable in its own right, did not lead to lasting contact between Europe and the New World, for the tiny settlements of Greenland were too small and too isolated to sustain regular voyages across the Atlantic, and the eventual decline and disappearance of the Greenland colonies in the 15th century meant that knowledge of the western lands was preserved only in the Icelandic sagas, documents that were little known outside of Scandinavia. When Columbus sailed westward in 1492, he did so without any awareness that Norse sailors had preceded him by nearly 5 centuries, and the European colonization that followed his voyages proceeded as though the Americas were being discovered for the first time. Yet the quiet evidence of Lanzo Meadows remains, a reminder that the history of human exploration is longer and more complex than we sometimes remember, and that the Vikings, those raceless sailors of the northern seas, had touched the shores of a new world and then, for reasons we can only partly understand, had let it slip away again into the mists of the Atlantic. And now we turn our thoughts to matters that lie beyond the reach of swords and longships, to the unseen realms that the Norse people believed existed all around them and beneath them and above them, woven together in ways that are perhaps best imagined while resting quietly, letting the mind drift across great distances of time and space. The Vikings, you see, lived within a cosmos that was far more intricate and interconnected than our simple division of heaven and earth, for they understood the universe to be composed of 9 distinct worlds, each with its own character and inhabitants, all of them held together by the roots and branches of an enormous ash tree that they called Yggdrasil, a name that meant something like the horse of the Terrible One, referring to Odin. And this tree stretched from the deepest wells to the highest reaches of existence, its trunk forming a kind of axis around which all reality slowly turned. The world tree Yggdrasil was not merely a symbol or a metaphor, but was understood to be genuinely present in the structure of the cosmos. Its 3 great roots reaching down into 3 different wells or springs, one of which was tended by the Norns, those mysterious beings who wove the fates of gods and mortals alike, sitting quietly beneath the branches and watering the roots so that the tree would not wither. In its highest branches sat an eagle who gazed out across all the worlds, and a squirrel named Ratatoska ran up and down the trunk, carrying messages and insults between the eagle and a serpent that gnawed at the roots far below. And 4 deer wandered among the branches eating the leaves, and this constant activity meant that Yggdrasil was always in a state of being damaged and healed, consumed and renewed, which reflected the Norse understanding that even the cosmos itself was not permanent, but subject to change and eventual ending. The 9 worlds included Asgard, the realm of the gods, who were called the Aesir, and it was here that the great halls of the divine beings stood, including Valhalla, which we shall come to shortly. There was also Midgard, which was our own world, the middle enclosure where human beings lived their brief lives, and it was connected to Asgard by the rainbow bridge called Bifrost, which shimmered with colors and was guarded by the watchman, god Heimdall, who could hear grass growing and required less sleep than a bird. Jotunheim was the land of the giants, those primordial beings who were often in conflict with the gods, but who also intermarried with them and possessed their own deep wisdom. Vanaheim was home to a different family of gods called the Vanir, who were associated with fertility and wealth, and who had long ago fought a war with the Aesir before exchanging hostages and making peace. There was Alfheim, where the light elves dwelled, and Svartalfheim, or Nidavellir, where the dwarves crafted their marvelous objects in underground forges, and Niflheim, a realm of ice and mist in the far north, and Muspelheim, a realm of fire in the far south. And finally, there was Hell, the underworld realm that received many of the dead and was ruled by a goddess who shared the realm's name. Among the gods who dwelled in Asgard, 3 figures stand out with particular clarity in the myths and in the archaeological evidence of worship. And the first of these was Odin, the All-Father, a god of tremendous complexity who presided over wisdom, poetry, death, and the mysteries of runic magic. Odin was not a simple or comforting deity, but rather a god who pursued knowledge with a hunger that bordered on obsession, and he had sacrificed one of his own eyes in exchange for a drink from the well of wisdom, so that he appeared in the myths as a one-eyed wanderer, grey-bearded and cloaked, carrying a spear called Gungnir that never missed its mark. He had also hung himself upon Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, wounded by his own spear, receiving no bread nor mead, peering downward into the depths until the runes revealed themselves to him with a great cry. And this self-sacrifice gave him mastery over the magical letters that the Norse used for divination and inscription. 2 ravens served as his eyes and ears across the worlds, flying out each dawn to gather news and returning each evening to whisper their reports into his ears. And their names were Hugin and Munin, meaning thought and memory. And it was said that Odin worried more about Munin returning than Hugin, perhaps suggesting that the loss of memory troubled him more than the loss of thought. Thor was altogether different in character, a god of thunder and protection, who was beloved by farmers and common folk, a straightforward deity who solved most of his problems by striking them with his hammer, Mjolnir, which always returned to his hand after being thrown, and which was so powerful that it required iron gloves to wield. Thor was the defender of Asgard and Midgard against the giants, driving across the sky in a chariot pulled by 2 goats that could be slaughtered and eaten each night, and then resurrected from their bones each morning. And the sound of thunder was understood to be the rumbling of his chariot wheels or the striking of his hammer. He was red-bearded and immensely strong, and had a temper that could flare suddenly, but a heart that was fundamentally good. And his hammer became one of the most common symbols in Viking material culture, appearing on pendants and rings and carved stones, often worn as a protective amulet. And when Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia, some craftsmen made molds that could produce both Thor's hammer pendants and Christian cross pendants, suggesting a practical flexibility in meeting the demands of the religious market. The goddess Freya belonged to the Vanir and presided over love and fertility and beauty, but also over a particular kind of warfare, for she claimed half of all warriors who fell in battle, taking them to her own hall called Folkvanga rather than to Odin's Valhalla. She possessed a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed her to fly between the worlds, and she wept tears of red gold when she grieved for her wandering husband. And she was also associated with the practice of seath, a form of magic that involved entering trance states and manipulating fate, which we shall discuss more fully in a moment. Her brother Frey was a god of prosperity and good harvests, and together the Vanir represented the fertile and peaceful aspects of divine power that complemented the more warlike and wisdom-seeking nature of the Aesir. Now we come to the matter of what happened after death, which was a question that occupied much thought in Viking Age Scandinavia, and the answer depended considerably on how one died. The most celebrated fate awaited warriors who fell in battle, for these were the ones whom Odin desired for his own purposes, and he sent the Valkyries to choose among the slain and carry the worthy ones up to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, which stood in Asgard with a roof made of golden shields and rafters made of spears. The Valkyries were female figures, sometimes depicted as beautiful and noble, sometimes as frightening and bloodthirsty, who rode through the air above battlefields, selecting those who would die and those who would survive. And their name meant choosers of the slain, and they served mead to the warriors in Odin's hall, and were objects of great fascination in the poetry and art of the period. In Valhalla, the chosen warriors, called the Einherjar, lived a remarkable existence that perfectly suited the Viking conception of a good life. For each day they would rise and put on their armor and go out onto the plain before the hall and fight one another in tremendous battles, hacking and slashing and dying gloriously. And then each evening they would rise again completely healed and return to the hall to feast on the meat of a boar that was slaughtered and cooked each day and regenerated each night. And they would drink mead that flowed from the udders of a goat that fed upon Yggdrasil's leaves. This endless cycle of fighting and feasting was not mere recreation, but rather training. For Odin was gathering his army against the day of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, when the forces of chaos would break free and assault Asgard, and the final battle would be fought. A battle that the gods knew they would ultimately lose, even as they prepared to fight it with full courage. Not everyone could go to Valhalla, however, for that fate was reserved specifically for those who died in combat. And the vast majority of people, those who died of illness or accident or old age, were understood to travel instead to the realm of Hell, which lay beneath the roots of Yggdrasil and was ruled by a goddess whose body was said to be half living flesh and half corpse. This was not a place of punishment in the way that the Christian hell would later be conceived, but rather a cold and grey and quiet place where the dead continued a shadowy existence, eating and drinking, but without the vigor and joy of the living or the glory of Valhalla. And the road to hell led downward and northward through dark valleys and across a bridge over a river that roared with knives. The distinction between Valhalla and hell reflected the Viking emphasis on dying well, on meeting one's end with courage and preferably with a weapon in hand. Though it should be noted that our sources for these beliefs come largely from texts written down after Christianization, and the actual beliefs of individual Vikings in the year 900 may have been more varied and less systematic than the mythology suggests. The burial practices of the Vikings reveal much about their beliefs regarding the afterlife, for they took considerable care to equip the dead for whatever journey or existence awaited them. The most spectacular burials were the ship burials, in which a deceased person of high status would be placed in an actual ship along with a wealth of grave goods. And the Oseberg burial discovered in Norway in 1903 provides perhaps the finest example, containing a beautifully carved ship, some 21 meters long, along with the remains of two women, one elderly and one younger, surrounded by beds and chests and sledges and a wagon and tapestries and kitchen implements and the bones of horses and dogs and oxen. The ship had been buried in blue clay that preserved the wooden objects remarkably well, and the craftsmanship of the carvings, with their interlacing animals and sinuous patterns, demonstrated the artistic achievement of early 9th century Scandinavia. Whether the dead were meant to sail to the afterlife in these ships, or whether the ships were simply appropriate possessions for great leaders, is not entirely clear, and both interpretations may contain some truth. Some of the dead were cremated rather than buried intact, their bodies burned on pyres along with their possessions, and sometimes with sacrificed animals and even sacrificed humans, and the ashes and remaining objects would then be gathered and placed under a mound. The Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling among the Rus people along the Volga River in the year 921 or 922, witnessed and recorded such a cremation ceremony for a chieftain, and his detailed account provides a vivid window into these practices. Even though the Rus were a mixed community of Scandinavians and Slavs, and their customs may not have been identical to those in Norway or Denmark, Ibn Fadlan described 10 days of preparation, during which a slave girl volunteered to die with her master. And during this period, she was treated with great honor and given considerable quantities of intoxicating drink, and she went from tent to tent engaging in ritual activities. And on the final day, she was lifted up to peer over a wooden frame and reported seeing her master in a green and beautiful paradise surrounded by his dead relatives, calling her to join him. The slave girl was then taken onto the ship where the chieftain's body had been placed, dressed in fine garments and surrounded by food and weapons and the bodies of sacrificed horses and dogs and cattle. And there an old woman, called the Angel of Death, who supervised such ceremonies, oversaw the final rites, while the girl was given more drink and sang songs that Ibn Fadlan was told were farewells to her companions. And then the girl was led into the tent on the ship where the chieftain lay, and several men went in with her, and without describing the details too closely, we may note that she was killed by strangling and stabbing together. And then the closest male relative of the chieftain walked backwards toward the ship with a torch and set the whole vessel ablaze, and the other mourners added their own torches and branches until the fire consumed everything. Ibn Fadlan records that a Russman laughed at his evident distress and explained that they burned their dead out of love, so that they would reach paradise immediately, rather than being eaten slowly by worms. The religious specialists who mediated between the human world and the worlds of gods and spirits included figures called Fulvus, who were seeresses capable of entering trance states and perceiving hidden things through the practice of seether magic. A Fulva would sit upon a high seat and enter an altered state of consciousness, often aided by chanting and drumming. And in this condition, she could answer questions about the future, about the location of lost objects, about the outcome of proposed actions. The Icelandic sagas contain several accounts of Fulvas traveling from farm to practice their art, and they were treated with a mixture of respect and unease, for the power to see into fate was not a comfortable gift. The god Odin himself was said to practice seether, which was considered somewhat shameful for a male to do, and the goddess Freya was the one who had taught the Aesir, this art when the gods of the two divine families had first met. The runic alphabet was used not only for ordinary communication, but also for magical and memorial purposes, and the Ruk runestone in Sweden, dating from around 800 AD, bears the longest known runic inscription, with some 700 characters carved into its surfaces in a complex arrangement. The inscription is challenging to interpret fully, but it includes references to the Gothic king Theodoric the Great, who had ruled Italy 3 centuries earlier, and to various mythological and legendary figures, and it seems to have been erected by a father in memory of his dead son, weaving together historical knowledge and mythological themes in ways that suggest the deep intermingling of these categories in the Viking mind. The runes themselves were understood to possess inherent power, and the act of carving them correctly was itself a form of magic. The old religion did not disappear suddenly, but rather faded gradually as Christianity spread through Scandinavia over the course of several centuries. Denmark was officially Christianized in 965 AD, when King Harald Bluetooth declared his kingdom Christian, an event that he commemorated on a great stone at Jelling that proclaimed his achievement in bringing the Danes to Christianity. Norway followed around the year 1000 AD under the influence of kings who had encountered Christianity abroad and returned determined to impose it upon their subjects, sometimes with considerable violence. Sweden was slower to convert, with the old temple at Uppsala continuing to function into the 11th century, and the process was not really complete until around 1100 AD, by which time the old gods had retreated from public worship into folk memory and eventually into the literary traditions that would preserve their stories for later ages to read, in beds and quiet rooms, thinking gently about those long ago people and the worlds they believed surrounded them, connected by the roots of a great ash tree that held everything together. And so we come now to a story that stretches across generations, a tale of one Viking chieftain whose descendants would reshape the history of Europe in ways that echo still today. This is a gentle telling, meant for the quieting hours, and we shall move through it slowly, as though tracing the branches of an ancient family tree by candlelight, following the path from a Norse warrior who refused to kneel to a duke who conquered a kingdom. The man known to the Franks as Rollo, and to his own Norse people as Rollo, first appears in the historical record as one of many Viking leaders who brought their longships up the River Seine in search of silver and plunder. He was, by all accounts, a formidable figure, and some later sources would claim he was so large that no horse could carry him, earning him the nickname Hrolfr the Walker, though we cannot know with certainty whether this detail is fact or the embellishment of later chroniclers who wished to make the founder of a great dynasty seem appropriately legendary. What we do know is that in the years 885 and 886, Rollo was among the Viking forces that laid siege to the city of Paris, that great and ancient settlement on the Ile de la Cité, where the Franks had retreated behind walls and fortified bridges. The siege of Paris was a prolonged affair, lasting many months through the cold of winter and into the following year. The Vikings numbered in the thousands, their ships crowding the Seine, and they sought not merely to raid, but to extract a vast tribute from the Frankish king, Charles the Fat. The Parisians, led by Count Odo and Bishop Goslin, held their city with remarkable determination, and though the Vikings tried many times to breach the defences, including the construction of siege engines and attempts to burn the bridges, the city did not fall. Eventually, Charles the Fat arrived with an army, but rather than driving the Vikings away through battle, he negotiated, allowing them to sail further upriver to raid the lands of Burgundy, which had defied his authority. It was an inglorious end to the siege, and Charles would later lose his throne for his perceived cowardice. But for Rollo, it was merely one chapter in a longer story of raids and negotiations that would ultimately lead to something far more permanent. In the years following the siege, Rollo continued to lead his warriors in raids along the Seine and the Loire, and the Frankish lands suffered greatly from these incursions. The new king, Charles the Simple, who had taken the throne in 898, faced the same dilemma that had troubled his predecessors, which was that the Vikings could not be defeated decisively in battle, and even when they were pushed back, they simply returned the following season with fresh warriors and ships. And so Charles arrived at a solution that was both pragmatic and, as history would prove, transformative. In the year 911, at a place called Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, a small settlement on the River Epte that marked the boundary between Frankish territories, Charles met with Rollo to negotiate a treaty. The terms of the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte were straightforward in their essentials. Rollo would receive a large territory around the Lower Seine, including the city of Rouen, which he and his Vikings had already effectively controlled. In exchange, Rollo would convert to Christianity, swear fealty to the Frankish king, and defend the coast against further Viking raids. He would also marry Gisela, who was said to be a daughter or possibly a close relative of Charles. The land granted to Rollo would come to be called Normandy, from the Latin Normanni, meaning men of the north, and it is by this name that we know the region to this day. There is a famous story told about the ceremony at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, one that illustrates rather neatly the difficulty of transforming a proud Viking chieftain into a humble vassal of a Frankish king. According to later chroniclers, the treaty required Rollo to perform an act of homage by kissing the king's foot, a gesture of submission that was customary in Frankish ceremonies of vassalage. Rollo, it is said, found this requirement deeply distasteful, for to a Norse warrior, such abasement was shameful beyond measure. Rather than perform the act himself, He ordered one of his subordinates to do it in his place. The Viking warrior who stepped forward, whether out of clumsiness, mockery, or simple indifference to Frankish sensibilities, did not bend down to kiss the royal foot. Instead, he grasped the king's leg and lifted it up to his own mouth, which had the effect of toppling King Charles backward onto the ground. The assembled Franks are said to have been horrified, while the Vikings laughed at the spectacle. Whether this incident actually occurred or was invented by later writers to illustrate the untamed nature of the first Normans, we cannot say with certainty, but the story has persisted through the centuries, and it captures something true about the uneasy beginning of Norman civilization, which was built upon a foundation of Viking pride that never entirely disappeared. Following his conversion and installation as ruler of Normandy, Rollo set about the work of governing his new territory, and he proved to be an effective administrator as well as a warrior. He distributed lands among his followers, established laws, and maintained order with a firm hand. The Vikings who settled in Normandy did not immediately abandon their old ways, and the first generation retained much of their Norse language and customs. But the process of transformation had begun, and with each passing decade, the Normans became more French. They adopted the language of their subjects, which was a form of Old French that would eventually become the Norman dialect, and they embraced Christianity with increasing sincerity, building churches and monasteries throughout their territory. They also adopted the Frankish system of feudalism, with its intricate web of lords and vassals, knights and serfs, which would become one of the defining characteristics of Norman society. Yet, even as they became French in language and religion, the Normans retained something of their Viking heritage, particularly their martial traditions and their restless energy. They were formidable warriors, skilled in cavalry tactics that they learned from the Franks, and they built castles and fortifications with great enthusiasm. They were also ambitious, always seeking new lands to conquer and new challenges to overcome. And this combination of French sophistication and Viking aggression would make them one of the most dynamic forces in medieval Europe. Rollo died sometime around the year 930, and he was succeeded by his son, William Longsword, who continued the work of consolidating Norman power and integrating the territory into the broader Frankish world. William Longsword expanded the boundaries of Normandy, was deeply committed to the Christian faith, and worked to suppress the lingering pagan practices among some of his people. He was murdered in 942 by agents of the Count of Flanders, but the duchy passed to his son, Richard, who would become known as Richard the Fearless, or more formally as Richard I of Normandy. Richard I ruled for over 50 years, a remarkably long reign during which Normandy grew in power and prestige. He was followed by his son, Richard II, who continued the family tradition of capable governance and maintained good relations with both the Frankish kings and the English across the Channel. Richard II's daughter, Emma, married two English kings in succession, first Ethelred the Unready and later Canute the Great, which created important dynastic ties between Normandy and England that would have profound consequences in the decades to come. Richard II was succeeded by his son Richard III, who ruled only briefly before dying under mysterious circumstances, and then by another son, Robert, who is sometimes called Robert the Magnificent and sometimes Robert the Devil, depending on the source. Robert ruled Normandy with energy and ambition, leading military campaigns and involving himself in the complex politics of France. He had a son by a woman named Herleva, who was not of noble birth, and this son was given the name William. Because his parents were not married, William was sometimes called William the Bastard by his enemies, a name that was meant to delegitimize his claim to the duchy. But when Robert died in 1035, while returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, it was this William, still only a boy of about 7 or 8 years, who inherited the title of Duke of Normandy. William's early years as Duke were marked by violence and instability, as various factions among the Norman nobility sought to control or eliminate him. Several of his guardians and advisors were murdered, and there were multiple attempts on his own life. But William survived, and as he grew to manhood, he proved himself a formidable warrior and a cunning politician. By the time he reached his 20s, he had established firm control over Normandy, crushing rebellions and defeating his enemies in battle. He was ambitious, determined, and utterly convinced of his own right to rule. Across the Channel, the throne of England had passed through several hands since the days of the Viking invasions. The current king was Edward, known as Edward the Confessor for his piety and his devotion to the church. Edward was the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, which made him William's cousin, and he had spent much of his youth in exile at the Norman court. Edward had no children, and the question of who would succeed him was a matter of great uncertainty and competing claims. William believed, or claimed to believe, that Edward had promised him the throne during a visit to Normandy, and that this promise had been confirmed when Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, had visited Normandy and sworn an oath to support William's claim. When Edward the Confessor died in January of 1066, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England, and William declared that this was a betrayal of sacred oaths and began preparing to invade. He gathered a great army and a fleet of ships, called upon his vassals and recruited volunteers from across France with promises of English land and plunder, and waited for favourable winds to carry him across the Channel. On September the 28th, 1066, William's fleet landed at Pevensey on the southern coast of England. Harold Godwinson was far to the north, having just defeated an invasion by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and he rushed south with his exhausted army to meet this new threat. The two forces met on October the 14th on 1066, at a place that would later be called Battle, near the town of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was a long and bloody affair, lasting most of the day. Harold's English forces, primarily infantry armed with axes and shields, formed a defensive line along a ridge, while William's army, which included a significant force of cavalry and archers, attacked from below. The English shield wall held firm through many hours of fighting, repelling charge after charge. But eventually, the Norman tactics began to tell. Whether through genuine retreat or deliberate feint, groups of Norman cavalry drew some of the English defenders down from their strong position, where they could be cut down more easily. As the afternoon wore on, the English line began to thin and waver. King Harold himself was killed during the battle, and the manner of his death has been a subject of fascination ever since. The Bayeux tapestry, that remarkable embroidered cloth that tells the story of the Norman conquest in pictures and Latin text, appears to show Harold struck in the eye by an arrow, though scholars have debated exactly which figure in the tapestry represents the dying king. Some have suggested that the figure being cut down by a Norman knight is Harold, while others argue that it is the figure reaching for an arrow in his eye, or perhaps that both figures represent Harold at different moments of his death. Whatever the precise circumstances, Harold was killed, and with his death, the English resistance collapsed. The Bayeux Tapestry itself is a remarkable artifact, stretching some 70 meters in length and depicting the events leading up to and including the Battle of Hastings in extraordinary detail. It was almost certainly commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who was William's half-brother and who played a significant role in the conquest, though the embroidery itself was likely carried out by English needlewomen, possibly in Canterbury. The tapestry provides an invaluable visual record of 11th century warfare, clothing, ships, and daily life, and it has survived for nearly 1,000 years, which is a remarkable thing to contemplate as you settle deeper into rest. Following his victory at Hastings, William marched through southern England, receiving the submission of the remaining English nobles, and on Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest had succeeded, and the descendant of Rollo the Viking, the man who had refused to kiss the Frankish king's foot, now wore the crown of England. In recent years, scientists have attempted to use DNA analysis to determine Rollo's origins more precisely, for the historical sources are contradictory on whether he was Norwegian or Danish. Studies of genetic material from individuals believed to be descended from Rollo through various lines have suggested a Norwegian origin, perhaps from the region around more in western Norway, though the evidence remains incomplete and the debates continue among scholars. What is certain is that Rollo was a Norseman, a Viking who came to Frankshire as a raider and stayed to found a dynasty, and that his descendants, through 5 generations of Norman dukes, carried that northern heritage into England, where it mingled with the Anglo-Saxon and Danish traditions already present. And so the story of Rollo and his wolf's descendants comes gently to its resting place, with the transformation complete, from Norse raiders to French dukes to English kings, across 2 centuries and countless miles of sea and land. The Vikings, who had once terrorized the coasts of Europe, had become the rulers of one of its greatest kingdoms, and their legacy would shape the English language, law, and culture for generations to come. But that is a story for another time, another gentle evening of rest, and for now, it is enough to let these facts settle like leaves upon still water, peaceful and complete. And so we come now to consider what remains, the quiet traces left behind by those seafaring people from the north, the Vikings, whose influence continues to ripple through our modern world in ways both obvious and remarkably subtle. For while the longships have long since rotted away, and the great halls have crumbled into green mounds beneath Scandinavian meadows, the Vikings left something far more enduring than timber and iron. They left words and laws and stories, and these have woven themselves so thoroughly into the fabric of our daily lives that we scarcely notice them at all, which is perhaps the most profound kind of legacy, the kind that becomes invisible through sheer familiarity. Let us begin with language, that most intimate of inheritances. For every time you glance upward and observe the sky, you are speaking a word that came to English from Old Norse, brought across the grey waters of the North Sea by settlers who made their homes in the east of England over 1,000 years ago. The Old English word for the heavens above was something quite different, but the Norse settlers said sky, and somehow their word prevailed, becoming so thoroughly English that no one thinks of it as foreign at all. And when you crack open an egg for your breakfast, you are again using a Norse word, for the Old English term was something closer to e. But the Scandinavian settlers brought their word with them, and it too became part of the language we speak today. Even the window through which morning light falls into your room carries a Norse etymology, coming from vindorga, which meant quite literally wind eye, a poetic description for that opening in the wall through which both light and air might pass. The domestic sphere is particularly rich with these borrowed words, and so when you sit down with your husband, that word too comes from Old Norse, from husbandi, meaning the master of the house. Should you reach for a knife to butter your toast, you hold in your hand not only a utensil, but another piece of Norse vocabulary, for the Old English term was seeks, but the Norse nif somehow felt right to the mingled populations of medieval England, and so it stayed. You might take these objects to a particular seat, and there again the word comes from the north. Or you might peer through the window once more. This one, a word that bears repeating for its lovely origin as that wind eye. If something seems wrong about the arrangement, that word too carries Norse ancestry, as does the feeling that something is merely odd, for both these terms descend from the language of the Longship people. Scholars who have studied these linguistic borrowings have identified well over 1,000 words in modern English that derive from Old Norse, and what is particularly interesting about this inheritance is how fundamental many of these words are. These are not exotic technical terms or words for unfamiliar objects. They are the plain vocabulary of everyday existence. Words for common things and basic actions and simple descriptions. This suggests something important about the nature of the Viking settlement in England. For you do not adopt another people's word for egg or sky or husband, unless you are living alongside them quite closely, unless your children are playing with their children and your families are sharing meals and markets and perhaps marriages. The linguistic evidence points to a deep and sustained mingling of populations, Anglo-Saxon and Norse living together so intimately that their languages blurred at the edges and eventually merged into something new. And if you should happen to conduct any of these domestic activities on a Thursday, you are honoring Thor, the Norse god of thunder, whose name became attached to the 5th day of the week. This is no accident, but rather a deliberate translation that occurred when Germanic peoples, including the Norse, adopted the Roman system of naming days after celestial bodies and associated deities. The Romans had dedicated this day to Jupiter, their thunder god, and so the Norse quite reasonably substituted their own deity of storms and lightning. Wednesday too carries a Norse divine name, though this one is shared with the broader Germanic tradition, for it honors Woden or Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed god who sacrificed himself to himself upon the world tree in pursuit of wisdom. Friday belongs to Frigg, goddess of marriage and motherhood, and so the calendar itself became a quiet memorial to the old religion. The names of gods spoken millions of times each week by people who have quite forgotten they are doing so. Beyond individual words, the Vikings contributed something perhaps even more significant to the English-speaking world, and this is a certain approach to law and governance that has proven remarkably durable. The concept of the jury, that assembly of ordinary citizens called upon to hear evidence and render judgment, has roots that reach back to Scandinavian legal traditions. The Vikings held assemblies called things, which were gatherings where free men came together to settle disputes, make laws, and render verdicts on those accused of wrongdoing. The Althing of Iceland, established in the year 930, is often cited as one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world, and while its functions were different from modern legislatures, it embodied a principle that power should be exercised collectively, and that the voices of free citizens mattered in questions of law and justice. The very word law itself comes from Old Norse, from lagu, meaning something laid down or established. And from the same legal vocabulary comes a term that has taken on a rather different meaning in modern English: the word outlaw. In the Viking Age, to be declared an outlaw was a formal legal status. It meant that you had been placed outside the protection of the law, that anyone might kill you without penalty, that you could own no property and claim no rights. It was in some ways a punishment worse than death, for it meant complete exile from human society, and those so condemned often fled to the wilderness to live as best they could among the wolves and ravens. The modern usage has softened considerably, coming to mean simply one who breaks the law rather than one formally expelled from its shelter. But the Norse origin remains visible in the word's structure. The greatest literary legacy of the Viking Age comes to us from Iceland, that remote island in the North Atlantic, where Norwegian settlers established a new society in the 9th century. The medieval Icelanders developed a passion for writing that seems remarkable given their small population and harsh environment, and they produced a body of literature that scholars continue to study and admire today. The Eddas stand as the primary sources for our knowledge of Norse mythology, containing the stories of Odin and Thor and Freya, of the creation of the world from the body of a giant, of the great tree Yggdrasil that connects the 9 realms, and of the final battle of Ragnarok, when gods and giants will destroy one another, and the world will be consumed by fire and flood before being reborn. The Poetic Edda is a collection of anonymous poems, preserved in a single manuscript known as the Codex Regius, and among its contents is the Voluspa, a visionary poem in which a seeress recounts the history of the cosmos from its beginning to its end. Within the verses of this extraordinary poem, there appears a list of dwarf names, and among them is one that should be familiar to anyone who has read the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. For the name Gandalf appears there, meaning something like staff elf or wand elf. Tolkien, who was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford and deeply learned in Old Norse literature, drew extensively upon these medieval sources for his creation of Middle-earth. The names of the dwarves in The Hobbit come almost entirely from that same list in the Voluspa, and the languages he invented for his elves bear the clear influence of his studies in Old Norse and its relatives. This is not borrowing in any shameful sense, but rather the natural continuation of a storytelling tradition, a modern author taking up threads from the medieval weavers and spinning them into new patterns. Beyond the Eddas, the Icelanders produced over 40 family sagas, long prose narratives that tell the stories of the early settlers and their descendants. These sagas are written in a distinctive style, spare and understated, presenting even the most dramatic events with a kind of cool detachment that some readers find almost modern in its sensibility. Characters are described through their actions rather than through elaborate psychological analysis, and violence, of which there is considerable quantity, is reported with the same level tone as the weather or the details of a business transaction. Scholars debate how much historical truth lies within these sagas, for they were written down 2 or 3 centuries after the events they describe, but they remain invaluable windows into how medieval Icelanders understood their past and their values. The 19th century witnessed a great revival of interest in the Vikings, particularly in Britain and Germany, though this enthusiasm was often accompanied by considerable distortion and romanticization. The composer Richard Wagner drew upon Norse mythology for his famous Ring Cycle, that massive sequence of 4 operas telling of gods and heroes, of cursed gold and doomed love, of the twilight of the divine powers. Wagner's Vikings are operatic in every sense, larger than life, swelling with emotion, draped in furs and armor, and very often wearing horned helmets. And here we must pause to note a gentle irony, for the horned helmet, that most recognizable symbol of the Viking warrior, is almost certainly a 19th century invention. Archaeological evidence shows that actual Viking helmets, when they were worn at all, were plain iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard, eminently practical and entirely free of decorative horns. The horned helmet seems to have been created by costume designers for theatrical and operatic productions, drawing perhaps on much older Bronze Age imagery or simply on their own romantic imaginations. And it proved so visually compelling that it never gone away. Modern science has begun to reveal aspects of the Viking world that the medieval chroniclers could never have known. For DNA analysis can now trace ancestry across 1,000 years of human generations. Studies of the British population have found that approximately 6% of the genetic heritage of England derives from Scandinavian sources, a figure that aligns well with what we know of the historical settlement patterns. But in Orkney and Shetland, those island groups off the northern coast of Scotland, the proportion rises dramatically to somewhere between 25 and 30%, reflecting the intense Norse colonization of these islands, which were for centuries more Scandinavian than Scottish in their culture and language. In the year 2020, the journal Nature published a landmark study that analyzed the genomes of 442 individuals who lived during the Viking era, drawing samples from burial sites across Scandinavia and the wider Viking world. The results contained some surprises, for they showed that the Viking Age population was considerably more diverse than many had assumed. Some individuals buried with typical Viking grave goods showed genetic ancestry from southern Europe or the British Isles, suggesting that Viking identity was perhaps more cultural than strictly hereditary, that people from various backgrounds could be absorbed into Norse society and become, in the eyes of their contemporaries, fully Viking. The study also traced the different directions of Viking expansion, showing that Danish Vikings tended to move toward England, while Norwegians sailed to Ireland, Scotland, and the North Atlantic islands, and Swedes ventured east toward the lands that would become Russia. Archaeological discoveries continue to expand our knowledge, and new technologies allow researchers to find sites that would have been invisible to earlier generations. In 2018, archaeologists in Norway announced the discovery of the Gjellestad ship, located not through traditional excavation, but through the use of ground-penetrating radar. This technology sends electromagnetic pulses into the Earth and measures the reflections, allowing researchers to detect buried structures without disturbing them. The Gjellestad ship lies beneath a farmer's field, its outline clearly visible in the radar images. And when archaeologists did begin careful excavation, they found that the ship had indeed survived, though in fragmentary condition, along with evidence of a wealthy burial. Such discoveries remind us that the Viking Age has not finished yielding its secrets, that beneath the fields and forests of Scandinavia there remain ships and halls and graves waiting to be found. There is something pleasantly unexpected in the way Viking influence surfaces in the most modern contexts, and perhaps no example is more charming than the wireless technology known as Bluetooth. This standard for short-range communication between electronic devices takes its name from Harald Bluetooth, a 10th century king of Denmark and Norway, who was credited with uniting various Danish tribes and converting his people to Christianity. The technology was developed in the 1990s by a consortium of companies, and an engineer working on the project suggested the name during an informal discussion, thinking of King Harold as a figure who brought people together, just as the technology would bring different devices together. The suggestion was meant as a placeholder, but it proved so fitting that it stuck. Even the Bluetooth logo is a reference to this long-dead king, for it combines two runes, the runes for H and B, Harold's initials, merged into a single symbol that now appears on billions of electronic devices around the world. And so the Vikings remain with us, in our words and laws and stories, in our very blood, though we seldom pause to notice. They were not the monsters of early medieval chronicles, nor the romantic heroes of Victorian opera, but simply people, farmers and traders and craftsmen and warriors, who lived their lives according to their own values and circumstances. Their world is gone now. The Longships sailed their last voyages long ago, but what they left behind has become part of who we are, and perhaps that is legacy enough.